I have a confession. I'm one of those people. The kind of girls who go to Starbucks and perch themselves at a table in the corner and spend the day there working. Now, in my defense, I don't sit there with a MacBook Air. I'm not a total cliche. I'm an artist and I do life drawings of things I see around the city. Never other people unless they ask or give consent, and sitting by a Starbucks window actually has a purpose. At least that's what I tell myself anyway, instead of just accepting that I'm on the cusp between millennial and Gen Z and a bit of a cliche of both. And during my almost daily visits to local Starbucks, I did notice a guy who kinda fit the cliche I'm insulting. He had an expensive, new-looking MacBook Pro, and he'd sit there throughout the day. Now, occasionally he'd type a sentence or two, often deleting and rewriting them, and then deleting them again, and then going to the barista to order another coffee. Sometimes he'd read these tattered old paperbacks, and I was thrilled to see that there wasn't a Jonathan Franzen, James Joyce, or Thomas Pynchon among them, although I would have given a Pynchon a maybe. Either way, it was clear that he was as much of a literary nerd as me, but like me, and unlike much of our generation, he wasn't pretending to read Ulysses or Gravity's Rainbow. And did you know, and I found this out from a Tinder date who was funny and honest, that some men crack the spines of their intellectual books to make it look like they've read them just to impress chicks. Now, I will admit, honestly, that did earn him a few more dates until he had to move out of state to look after a sick mom, and that kind of sucked. So back to Starbucks writer man, he was cute in a bookish, tousled blonde hair, slightly dad bod way, i.e. exactly my type. Now, I'm not exactly shy, and if I'm attracted to a guy, then I won't make a secret of checking him out, but I also won't make the first move. I can't completely kill the age of chivalry for 8th wave feminism or whatever wave we're on now. Now anyway, I was pretty psyched and a little thrilled when I caught writer guy checking me out. I'd worn the most manic pixie dream girl outfit I could think of. A plaid skirt, a beret, and some blouse or other I forget. Yes, I know I'm a cliche. Now wait until you find out that I'm an artist, but I'm a cool artist. I draw comics, nothing for the big two yet, but I have worked on a couple of titles for comic publishers you definitely have heard of. And at the time, though, I was still building up my portfolio, so I was mostly doing sketches and perspective practices and poses and things, rather than Spider-Man punching the crap out of the Shocker. Dream panel to draw, though. Anyways, writer guy first approached me by casually passing by my table after buying his third latte of the day. He pretended to tie his shoe and asked if I minded him placing the latte on the table. I said go ahead. It was no problem. And he said something about how he wouldn't want to spill his latte on my sketchbook. And then to his credit, he said something like, "I see you're an artist," instead of asking if I was, when he could see full well that I was an artist. And I told him that yeah, I was, and we ended up having an hour-long conversation about comics, still life, perspective, all sorts of things. And it was clear that he didn't know a ton about composition and the various nerdy details I was bringing up. But again, to his credit, he listened and seemed to pay attention without interrupting. When I was done talking, I asked him what kind of writer he was. Now here was where things got a little odd, because he was extremely cagey about it. I tried to flirtily coax the details from him, but all I could discover was that he wrote a combination of fact and fiction, meddled with metafiction, and was settling on a style. Now over the next few weeks, we hung out every now and then at the coffee shop. Not for long, we both had work to do, but if we saw each other there, then we'd have a little chat. I appreciated that he wasn't the type of guy who'd make a note of my schedule and turn up exactly whenever I did. I don't know, I guess being terminally online left me on high alert for red flags. And yes, the Starbucks had free Wi-Fi, so I really was terminally online, and I just wasn't seeing any red flags at all. And it turns out that the reason that I wasn't seeing any small red flags was because the guy was just one giant walking, talking red flag, and I guess I was colorblind. Now, the more we talked, the more we learned about each other, which, thinking about it, isn't true at all. We learned about each other's artistic ambitions, writing and drawing, and I asked him some things about his life. He was currently between salary jobs, living in his buddy's spare room trying to build a Twitch career in the evenings for if this writing thing didn't work out. And I remember him saying that he was a big fan of Moist Critical, and me telling him the word moist grossed me out, a word which he then used to tease me a lot. And I laughed throughout it, but in retrospect it was kinda weird. Like, yeah bro, my coffee is moist. The towelette is moist. I get it, you're trying to be flirty. And still a cave woman trying to headbutt the cave wall to create a shelf, I was too stupid to see any of the signs. I should add here, for anyone confused about the timelines, this went down in the summer of 2022. Starbucks had long since dropped their mandatory masking policy in most locations, and ours was one of them, thank God. I don't think I could have spent an entire day every day wearing those stupid things. Now, I didn't notice at the time, and looking back, I don't think Writer Guy really asked anything meaningful about me. I mean, there wasn't much to tell, but it would have been nice for him to show some interest in the degree that I'd studied. Surprisingly, nothing to do with art, an interesting story in and of itself, I think. Or what my family situation was, if I had siblings, one much older stepbrother and 3 sisters, one of whom at the time was basically an 18-year-old Karen. And he just showed no interest in my life outside of Starbucks other than my plans as an artist and career aspirations. Mostly he talked about how he wanted to get an agent, wanted to get a publishing deal, wanted to be the next big name in the literary world, etc., like a lot, and repetitively. And you know what I decided at the time? I convinced myself that his shallow conversation was because he was building up to ask me out, and he was super awkward and shy about it. Yeah, the dude had no game, and that was pretty obvious. So latching onto the few things that we had in common, then repeating them, it made some sense to me. The dumbest part, at this stage I would have said yes if he just asked me out, and then I would have made sure that he found out more about me and vice versa. It had been a while since I dated, and thanks to the last couple of years, so I blame that for my bad judgment. Eventually I decided that if I was going to get some, I had to act. Even a movie date would do, and second base would be great. Third base would be more than enough, just literally anything. A date, a kiss, a modicum of interest from a guy who very clearly did find me attractive, considering how often I caught him checking me out. And I decided that the best way forward was to start being as flirty as I could with him without looking like a desperate, well, you know. And so one day, I had this great plan. Instead of buying our usual coffees from the counter so he'd see me come in, I drove through the drive-thru and bought our drinks that way. So when I entered the cafe, which thankfully didn't have a bell over the door, he wouldn't notice me as he sat writing facing my usual table, which was near the side window that looked out onto one particular street that I was fond of. I handled the door like a pro despite holding 2 coffees and crept up on Writer Guy. And the first thing I noticed was that there was actually text on the page. Now, maybe I'm the a-hole here because he always refused to tell me what he wrote because it wasn't ready, quote-unquote. But I couldn't help taking a peek before surprising him with the drinks. And what I saw made my jaw drop. And hey, I'm not a writer, so I'm not allowed to use dumb cliches like that, but I can't remember it word for word, obviously, but I do remember that he was writing in size 16 font or something ridiculous, which was extremely helpful. He was on chapter 5, and it began talking about how we'd established over the last chapters that by default, women are, well, words I can't really ask you to say on YouTube, and they're typically reserved for women of the night. And below that, he had written that he met a new girlfriend, and while she clearly was as loose as the others, she seemed to like him compared to other women. He had then written a screed about how, because he had me around his little finger, he could use my artistic talents to draw a comic he'd written, which would involve a character based on me who he could persuade to draw naked. Bonus points if I'd allow him to take reference photos. It was some kind of dramatically misguided pickup artist book coupled with an autobiography of how a loser like him had duped a hot chick like me. And I just stood there and read it all 3 times and then walked to the side of the table, placed his coffee down and told him that I bought this for him as a surprise. But that it turned out he was the one to surprise me. And at first he didn't understand what I meant until he saw me looking at the laptop screen. He slammed it closed and then started screaming that he hadn't given me permission to read his writing and that I was lacking the nuance and understanding to appreciate what he meant and various other things. He basically dug himself a 6-foot hole. The barista, who I also knew through his boyfriend, was a physio trainer and came over and asked if everything was okay. And this writer guy screamed that everything was not okay. I had read his erotic fiction about me without his permission. Again, it was like he wanted to bury himself. And the barista told him that perhaps he'd better leave, while flexing his bicep in very much a type of I could throw you out if I wanted to, buddy type way. Now, writer guy snarked at him and then looked around frantically for something to do. He didn't want to just lose by leaving, and so he grabbed the coffee that I brought him and flung it against the Starbucks logo on the wall. And then, even more fired up, he screamed that I'd ruined everything. Shocking me and the barista, he grabbed up his expensive, new-looking MacBook Pro, I'm pretty sure it was a 16-inch too, and then flung it in anger against the tiled floor of that Starbucks. Now, this laptop exploded into these weird pieces of glass and plastic and keyboard keys and circuitry, you name it. And then the writer's guy's eyes widened as if realizing what he'd done, and then he charged out the door, actively beginning to sob. The barista asked me if I wanted to call the cops or anything, but I didn't think it was really worth it. I told him I didn't know the guy's actual name even, but the barista replied that he did, from credit card receipts. And that was a relief, at least, in case things did escalate, but I was pretty sure they wouldn't. Well, I was wrong. I took a couple of weeks break from visiting that Starbucks just because I didn't like the idea of him spying on me from another store or anything like that, but eventually I was like, screw it. I'm not having my favorite place ruined by that thing. And when I entered, imagine my utter surprise when I saw who was sitting at the table facing my usual seat. Writer guy. And I looked over to the barista, and it was a young girl, maybe just out of high school, and I guess maybe there was no way to warn the other baristas who'd been banned. No security footage or visual footage or anything. And I decided that screw it. I wasn't leaving. I walked up to the counter, ordered my usual, and then told the barista that she might want to watch out for the guy by the door. I said that I had a bad experience with him and he'd been aggressive. She told me the manager didn't actually allow permabans of customers unless the cops had been involved, which explained that. And she also told me, though, that she'd gotten serious creeper vibes from him and how he'd openly stare at her breasts when he talked to her and how he reached out to touch her name badge before she pulled away. And I felt so stupid. How had I ignored all these strange things just because I found him cute? How had I even found him cute in the first place? Not accounting for taste, I suppose, and I guess mine at the time was wannabe PUA who pretends to be a sensitive nice guy. Sadly, a common trope in later years. And as I was heading to my table, writer guy called me over. I contemplated ignoring him, and I knew he was only going to come over to my table if I did, so I walked over there and he immediately started apologizing, groveling and begging, tears in his eyes, all sorts of stuff, and then he started begging me if we could pick up where we left off, because he was certain that an erotic graphic novel featuring the both of us would be a huge seller. Well, that had escalated, and now apparently he evolved into the eroticism as well. I told him that in no uncertain terms was I his girlfriend, and I'd never been his girlfriend. I'd never be writing a graphic novel with him, and I never wanted to see him again. And he just sat there in silence for a moment, and a tiny, tiny part of me hoped that he was genuinely thinking about his actions. Instead, he reached out for the brand new looking MacBook Pro that he'd been writing on. And please just take it and leave it, I thought. And I swear down that he had bought a replacement MacBook Pro, although at least it looked like a 14-incher this time, and now he was snatching that up. Now surely he wasn't going to. And with some shriek of anger, basically a howl, he slammed this new MacBook Pro down onto the floor of that Starbucks. And once again, the ridiculously expensive laptop exploded in a shower of debris and electronic crap. And the guy just stood there, breathing heavily and furiously for a second, and I thought maybe he was going to attack me. And instead, suddenly, it was like all the rage dissipated from his body as he looked down at the second shattered MacBook Pro on the floor, and then he let out a scream and ran out the door. I can't be sure, and maybe this is just cruel, wishful thinking, but I'm sure I heard him yell, "Not again, Mom's gonna kill me," or something before the door swung shut. I wouldn't be surprised. Now this time I did get the cops involved, just so that they were able to get him permanently banned from that Starbucks. And it was easy enough for the cops to consider his actions for the destruction of property, even though it was his own property, since the laptops also damaged some of the tiles, so he got banned, and I avoided a living red flag, and I still get to visit my favorite coffee place. Only now, I'm drawing comics for writers whose names you probably haven't heard of, and most definitely wouldn't treat me this way. And that's pretty sweet, all told, but the insanity that I experienced with that writer guy, holy crap. Maybe one day that could make for a comic book of its own. Maybe he was just on drugs. It was the summer of 1996. The world was in turmoil, probably, I can't quite remember. It's always in turmoil. And in truth, I can't remember much about 1996 except that I was 22 in my senior year of college, and I was dating someone named Rhea, the absolute hottest chick I have ever been with before or since, apart from my lovely wife, who, of course, makes my ex in question look like some swamp donkey. But honestly, and my wife has given me permission to say this because she knew Rhea too back in those days, this girl was ethereally beautiful, delicate, elven features, strawberry blonde hair that caught the red in the afternoons and the blonde in the morning. She was stunning when I woke up next to her, even if after our first few nights together she'd jokingly freak out that I saw her without makeup. And she was the kind of girl who applied it in a way that the average dude would say that she didn't wear makeup at all. If I hadn't seen her spend an hour at the mirror painstakingly contouring her face in the most subtle manner, I would have thought that her beauty was entirely natural, and of course it was. She just amplified it in these gentle ways. And to call her a goddess feels wrong because she wasn't some kind of all-powerful being who commanded men and dominated a room. She was more like the most beautiful specter you've ever seen, or a fairy made human. At least, all of this was how she looked. As a person, she was kind of, let's just say, neurotic. She had specific things that she'd focus on. She wasn't autistic or anything like that, she just had weird things that she'd focus on. For example, if she wore a short skirt when we went out, she'd regularly ask me if she was accidentally flashing people. If I said no, it was just hanging just fine, then she'd just shrug and drop it. If I said that it was a bit windy so people might have seen a brief glimpse of the side of her underwear, she'd just shrug and drop it. She'd regularly ask me how many beers we had in the fridge, and if we had less than 4, she'd make me go on a grocery run to top it off to at least 6. And she didn't even drink beer. She collected CDs, but I don't think that I'd ever heard her listen to anything but the radio. Just these weird little quirks that for various reasons I'm pretty sure that she did deliberately because she was trying to be cute. It was the era of the quirky girl, and she'd often say things like, "I was born in the wrong era." But when I asked her what era she should have been born in, she'd think about it and then say, "This one, I guess." Now, I'm making her sound nuts, but this really was about 2% of her behavior. For the most part, we had a normal, healthy relationship. She liked going out for drinks and hanging with my friends, and she had one best friend who was also kinda hot, and while she was very friendly towards me, at the time I was convinced that she had a thing for Rhea. And my friends, who were all just regular guys around our age, were naturally kinda jealous that I'd hooked up with this elven princess. I was kind of the leader of that gang though, and I worked out a lot, and I think they all knew that I probably would have knocked them the F out if I'd caught them hitting on Rhea. And of course, her hot friend Cedar, yeah, apparently that's her real name, claimed to be married to a Russian in prison for murder. And she seemed to take great delight in shutting my friends down if they so much as put their arm around her. And plot twist, because it's not a very interesting way to end the story, Cedar was not in fact married to a Russian murderer, and that was just some crap Rhea made up, and Cedar is now my beautiful wife with whom I have 2 beautiful children. Now anyway, with all that out of the way, back to Rhea's other main obsession, and this one did impact our relationship a decent amount. Rhea was absolutely obsessed with the idea of making money in the most unusual ways. She didn't want to get rich, she didn't care how much money she had, she just wanted to find money-making schemes that would get people talking. We were both fairly well off thanks to some inheritance and kind parents respectively, so it's not like she needed to focus on anything but grad school. And we were both studying various STEM subjects, and realistically it was a complete waste of time for either of us to go looking for work. But that wasn't what it was about for Rhea. She wanted to get paid, any kind of amount, for something unusual, and it was the strangest quirk I've maybe ever seen in a person. Now, for examples, she charged a local grocery store owner $10 to paint a huge, beautiful mural on the side of her store that pointed into the yard. And the creation of the mural and hiring a few people to help meant that she ended up at a loss of $190. She didn't care. She'd been paid $10 to paint a mural in the city, which is something very few people could claim. Another example, and okay, this one was kind of cool and I was a little jealous that she landed that job and I didn't. She spent one Halloween working as a murderous clown schoolgirl in a haunted house, where her sole job was to jump out, yell boo, giggle, and then run away. She took the job for $3 an hour and worked 10 hours a day for a week, and to her, that was a win. Finally, she hit me with the craziest idea yet. So, a week prior, we'd watched the movie Forrest Gump. She began the conversation by sort of coyly asking if I remember the movie well, which obviously I did. It was the previous week. And I told her yes, and she replied saying the movie had given her an ideal money-making idea. I was expecting her to suggest some kind of walking initiative where people donated to her, or probably me, trailing behind, holding the donation bucket until she got bored. No, I couldn't have been more wrong. She asked me if I remembered the scene where Jenny, Forrest's one true love, plays guitar in the club. Now, I did remember it because it was kind of notable, obviously, and if you haven't seen the movie, she performs naked, and her nudity is covered up by the guitar. And so this was Rhea's plan. She was going to pitch the idea to small, artsy bars and clubs that she played raw acoustic songs, well, raw and naked. And this is someone who wouldn't wear a bikini to the beach and was only really comfortable showing off her legs, and certainly nothing above the waist or definitely between it. And even with me, she wasn't exactly the type to just stroll around the apartment nude, and after bedroom activities she almost scrambled to pull a robe on or something. And here she was, wanting to basically perform guitar pieces naked in front of a bunch of artsy strangers. And I tried to explain to her that it wasn't like the movie. They used clever cuts and camera angles to avoid the fact that Jenny could have almost certainly been seen totally naked by a number of patrons, not to mention the backstage people, etc. And Rhea told me that no, she was confident she could manage to pull it off without actually revealing her body to anyone. And I decided to just leave that and move on to asking her about the performance itself. And it turns out that she'd never tried to attempt to learn the guitar. I could play the guitar pretty well, actually, to the point that I was in a pretty amateurish unsigned band. And so, of course, I was roped into teaching her guitar. But she was hopeless. We practiced and practiced and practiced, and even though I kept advising her that she was over-practicing and making things harder, she was having none of it. And eventually she could successfully strum a G chord and occasionally switch from a G to a shaky C and then back again. And Rhea decided that this was enough for now, and she was on track to become a guitarist. And besides, acoustic performances were meant to be raw and simplistic. I wasn't prepared to argue this, so I just asked her to let me hear her sing. And I imagined that at least she was one of those girls who sang in her hairbrush in the mirror, and given how beautiful her speaking voice was, I was at least expecting something. Imagine a cat being strangled. Now imagine a cat being strangled while having a cactus shoved where no cactus should go. The sound that cat made would be melodic compared to Rhea's singing. I genuinely couldn't even work out what song she was attempting, and when she told me it was Patti Smith's song with a title I most certainly can't say on YouTube, you could have knocked me down with a butterfly. She asked me if she was as good as she'd been told and if she was ready to sing in bars. And I had two choices here. I could let my girlfriend have the most embarrassing night of her life, or I could tell her the truth and take the heat for a day or so. And I opted for the latter. And Rhea absolutely lost it. I'd never seen her behave like this before, not even close. And she began shrieking, just these noises aimed at nobody in particular, running her hands through her hair like she was shampooing it. And that's when she told me that she'd booked her first gig for 2 weeks from then. And it was at the local open mic basement bar run by one of our friends that we knew. We knew everyone there. Our friends hung out there. My ex, who was on great terms with, was the bartender, and this basically meant that not only would our entire friendship group see my girlfriend nude, no matter how convinced she was that she could keep herself covered, it also meant that they'd hear her acting like an absolute mental patient while taking herself completely seriously. I considered the idea of trying to persuade her to present it as comedy, or maybe even anti-comedy, or freaking something that wouldn't end in an unmitigated disaster. And I begged her to cancel it, and before I could even react, she grabbed up my old acoustic guitar that we'd been using to learn and smashed it over my head. Now, it knocked me unconscious probably for like 10 seconds, I think, and I'm lucky as hell that my head is apparently very hard because it caused the strings to snap instead of cutting too deep into my scalp. There was blood though, and splinters that were dangerously close to my eyes and lips. I carefully stood up, holding my head downwards to make sure that I didn't get wood in my eyes, and this means that I missed Rhea's grand exit. And all I could hear was, "I'm leaving forever," and the door slamming behind her. Now, of course, she didn't leave forever. She had to awkwardly return a few days later to get some things, which took up about half the apartment. She tried apologizing to me, but it was the kind of apology where she clearly just wanted me to see her side. And along with that, she'd smashed my old acoustic guitar over my freaking head. That instrument had been inherited from my grandfather and had survived a number of middle school, high school, and college parties and bonfires. Don't worry though, I never played Wonderwall or Stairway. Now anyways, I essentially threw Rhea out and then time passed on. I had to visit the bar on the night of her supposed first performance just so I could try and stop it, but thankfully she wasn't there. Her friend, as you know, my now wife, Cedar, was there though, and it turns out we were both there to prevent Rhea from making a complete nude ass of herself, pun intended. Cedar and I drew closer over time, and I soon discovered that there was a side to Rhea that I'd never seen. Apparently, she'd been known as a queen bee mean girl in high school and had only befriended Cedar in college after Cedar had lost a bunch of weight and gotten hot. And some of the old stories that she told me about Rhea from high school were just downright deranged. For example, she performed a solo dance routine at the school talent show, changing her song and choreography at the last minute and then screaming at the audience when they didn't give her a standing ovation. She decided that certain girls, and even a few of the more docile boys, had slighted her in some way, so she'd go out of her way to sabotage them and get them into trouble while remaining sneaky clean. And when I asked Cedar why she'd become friends with Rhea and why she'd never warned any of us, she became quiet and introspective. Eventually, she admitted to me that she was a pretty devout Christian, and she believed in forgiveness and allowing people to change, and that Rhea had completely managed to convince her during college that she was a much better person. I couldn't blame her. I haven't even suspected this side of her. And shortly after, Cedar and I began dating, and as usual, we hung out with our friend group at that bar. It was open mic night, and who should take the stage but Rhea, clutching a tiny pink ukulele. Now, I was deeply relieved to find that she was fully clothed instead of trying to cover all of her most intimate bits with a tiny uke. Now, what followed was somehow even worse than the guitar performances. And by the end, even some of our friends were screaming to get off the stage and never come back. Cedar and I decided to sneak out the back door. Unfortunately, I froze when I heard Rhea scream my name, and she began screaming that I was the guy who sabotaged her music career. She claimed that I'd somehow made her bad at playing guitar, and she insisted that I tried to persuade her to perform nude, and what a creep this made me. And of course, most of my friends knew at least part of the story and knew it was all nonsense. And I just turned to leave, but Cedar shouted out for me to watch out. Rhea had hurled her little pink ukulele neck over head straight towards me, almost like a throwing axe. Now, thankfully, I was able to dodge the uke, which shattered into some pieces in one of the concrete pillars that held up the bar. I could see the fury in her eyes, though, and I knew it wasn't over. This time she grabbed a beer glass that was almost full, much to the anger of the guy who'd been about to take a sip from it, and she flung it, but of course she had no hope of hitting me from that distance. Now, that didn't stop our little military buddy Sid from stepping in the way of that glass anyways, though, and unfortunately it did hit him and shattered right into his face. I'd never seen anything like it. There were shards of glass everywhere, and some of them were even sticking out of Sid's cheek. One thin shard was pierced almost through his nose, and a sliver had gone right through his lip. Now, worse was the long, bloody piece that was a fraction of an inch below his eye socket. And you know what the goddamn legend did? He turned to me, he grinned, causing more blood to pour from his face, and said, "Told you I'd take a bullet for you one day." Now, thankfully, Sid didn't need any convincing. He just obviously pressed charges against Rhea, who quite clearly either had some kind of mental illness or severe anger management issues. And even though I don't quite agree, the courts ruled that she was perfectly sane to stand trial, and she spent 6 months in prison, 2 years on probation, and some fairly lengthy stint of anger management therapy when she came out. Naturally, Cedar and I also took a restraining order out against her, which was granted. No, I have no idea what's become of Rhea now, and I'm not sure I want to know. I'm a woman in my 20s, and I've been a long-time listener. I never had the guts to write this out before because I can't write to save my life, but I'll give it a go anyway. And you know what they say, you miss every shot you don't take. Now, I'm generally quite a mousy, quiet woman who keeps to herself. I work in a bookstore, and I like to listen to true crime podcasts, just like yours, and I watch Netflix. I'm really boring, and I'm not ashamed of that fact. I learned early on that excitement isn't always positive and isn't always what it's cracked up to be, and you can thank dear old mom and dad for that and the absolute pig-poo effort that they made in raising me. Thankfully, my older sister was there to make sure that I was always fed, cleaned, and that my clothes smelled at least relatively fresh. I love you, Audrey. I wouldn't have made it this far in life without you. Now, thankfully, this creepy story doesn't involve something terrible happening to my older sister, but it does once again show her looking out for her little brat kid sis. And when I was in middle school, I was the most awkward, gangly preteen you could possibly imagine. Actually a pretty short queen, but as I was growing up, my body felt like it was all arms and legs and elbows and knees. And my hair was a constant curly mess that I regularly burned with straighteners until Odd showed me how to actually use them. And oh yeah, I had braces and a retainer, and in high school, guess what? Acne. And it might seem like I'm being harsh on myself, but I was the ugly duckling. I'm actually pretty happy with how I look now, so I guess the years of suffering were worth it. There is a reason for this rambling, though. I'm sorry. During our first semester of our last year at middle school, one of the coolest boys in my year asked me out. Now, looking back, he was a complete try-hard emo, but he smoked behind the gym, and he wore a black trench coat, and he said the F word in front of the teachers. He was a rebel, and he told me that he wanted to be my boyfriend. At first, I said no because I thought that it had to be a prank. And it soon became clear that it wasn't, though, and for 6 months, I dated the guy who I thought was the most badass guy in our year. And I'm pretty sure people laughed at him behind his back and to his face, but he always hid that from me, and I never stopped thinking that he was the coolest guy since the Fonz himself. Anyway, my cool emo boyfriend was named, or at least nicknamed, Cheese, and he never would tell me why, but he seemed to like the nickname and was cool with me calling him Cheese, and so I did. And then one day, without any warning, he told me that he was leaving school after the weekend and moving to a different state because his father had been reassigned to the New York office. I think he was a lawyer or a hedge manager or something like that. I thought Cheese was joking. He had a habit of teasing me with things like we're breaking up or so-and-so is dead, and he'd just seen the principal and our teacher doing it in the closet, and a baby popped out and looked at him, and that was a Simpsons joke, so I always remember that one. Turns out he wasn't kidding, and he simply never showed up to school on Monday. Didn't leave me some forwarding address, didn't call me, just completely ghosted me. Maybe that was the prank. Maybe he'd always known that he'd be leaving then. Jump forward 13 years. I'm sitting in my local coffee shop making use of their Wi-Fi when I get a Facebook friend request. Now it's from someone called Nathan Lester, and his profile picture is just some anime ninja. Now anyway, I didn't deny the friend request. I never got friend requests really, but I didn't accept it either. And when I clicked on his profile, I saw that we had 3 mutual friends, all from middle school, and a message request pinged, so I accepted it. Hi, it's Cheese from middle school. And that's when I realized Nathan Lester, Red Lester, is a kind of cheese especially popular over in the UK. That's probably how he'd gotten that nickname. We chatted on Facebook for a few days, and he was kind of very talky, reminiscing on old times that I'd barely even thought about or even remembered. And it worried me a little, but maybe he was just excited to reconnect with an old friend. Now, he had moved around the country due to his father's job after all, and I accepted his friend request and saw that he was a self-employed freelancer who'd graduated college. And despite feeling like a stalker, I went through all of his photos, which I couldn't find a single one of him. They were all animated characters, mostly anime, and a bunch of pictures of cats, which was adorable. And eventually he asked me if I wanted to meet him in a public place to catch up. And the fact that he specified a public place really put me, I guess, at ease. Some guys will wait for girls to suggest that just in case they can get us back to their apartments for a one-night stand. I suggested my local coffee shop, and to my surprise, he said that he was a regular too. I'd never seen him there, but I visited in the mornings. Maybe he was an afternoon guy. And when I showed up, I was the only customer in the cafe. I said hi to the employees, who I was vaguely friends with, and sat down. Now, I'm really going to try and be mean in the next part, but facts are facts. As I was drinking my coffee and reading my book, a short, portly man in cargo shorts and a t-shirt with holes in it sat down opposite me. I told him, as politely as I could, that I was waiting for someone, and he said something like, "Wait no more. Cheese is here." Well, darn. This was him. And when I spoke, I could see that most of his teeth looked disgusting. His skin was terribly unwashed and greasy, and he was balding in the way that had given himself a comb-over in this sort of monk's hairstyle. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with being bald. Most women actually find it pretty attractive, so if you do start losing your hair early, my advice is to not make yourself look like a serial killer. And we haven't even begun talking when Cheese told me that he needed a huge favor, and could I loan him $500 to pay off a credit card. He said that he'd be able to get me the money back in 6 months to a year. I told him I didn't remotely have the kind of money to lend him. Now, this wasn't entirely true, but profusely apologized, and deep down, I was pretty furious though. I gave him the benefit of the doubt because he started talking about our times in middle school like they were the best years of his life. And then it kind of made me sad when I realized that this might actually be true. Unfortunately, he ruined that when he kept referring to our meetup as a date, and then he told me that he'd never met another girl like me, and in fact, he'd never dated anyone since our little tryst in middle school. And believe it or not, we didn't even kiss, because I was the one for him, and we were destined to be together. Now, trying to be as pleasant as I could, I told him that I'd been under the impression that this was just a friendly catch-up. And then he asked if I'd dated anyone since him, which obviously yes, I had. And next came the "are you a virgin" question. Oh my god, come on, dude. I'm 25 and I just told you I had previous adult relationships. Do you really need to know if we did the deed? And here I lied and told him that I actually had a boyfriend now and that I didn't think that he'd be very happy with the way this meeting was going, so maybe I should just leave. He yelled something like, "Not if I leave first," and stormed out, leaving me with some bill for the various coffees and 3 expensive cakes that he'd ordered. As I was driving home, I called Audrey, or Officer Audrey as I teasingly called her, because, yeah, my older, protective sister had gone on to be a cop. And when I returned to my apartment, the ancient receptionist told me that a delivery man had taken a package up for me and then left. Now, this wasn't alarming by itself. I ordered from Amazon pretty often, and when I reached my hallway, I couldn't see any package on the ground, though. But what I did see was a replica ninja throwing star there and a dent in the door where someone had clearly tried and failed to stab it into the door as some type of threat. Instead, stuck next to the groove with a little sticky tack was a note that read, "I'll see you again." Of course, Officer Audrey absolutely refused to let me stay alone. She was currently living with her boyfriend, who I was pretty friendly with, so I assumed that I'd just sleep on the couch over there for a while. Audrey surprised me, though, by saying that she was coming to stay at my apartment. That way, if Cheese did try anything, then Big Sister Cop would be waiting for him. Now, after a few nights of Audrey sleeping at my place, we heard a banging on the door. It wasn't like a knocking, but a sound as if someone was trying to kick the door open. The door barely even shuddered, so the intruder wasn't exactly the most competent. Audrey called some of her on-duty buddies while I tried to listen through the door. Unfortunately, my apartment had been bust into during a SWAT raid before I moved in, and the door that they'd installed as a replacement didn't have a peephole. And sadly, I wasn't able to see whether this assailant was Cheese or if this was just some insane coincidence. Now, before I could really act, Audrey decided that she was bored of waiting for her backup and threw the door open inwards. Now, even though she shouldn't have because she was off duty, Audrey held up her gun. She didn't point it at the door kicker, she just held it up in that position that cops do. And it was Cheese at the door. All 300 sweaty, heavy-breathing pounds of him. And this wasn't my point of concern, though. My biggest concern was the large, thin sword that Cheese was holding over his shoulder like some kind of martial arts movie protagonist. Audrey shoved me out of the way, and Cheese brought that sword down hard on her shoulder. It cut into her flesh, but just the flesh, as this sword was clearly just some replica that Cheese had sharpened, and it wasn't a good replica either because it shattered into pieces as it caused the flesh wound on Aubrey's left shoulder. But, oh hell, you don't attack a cop with a sword, especially when 3 of her unit buddies burst into the hallway and tased the absolute crap out of Cheese. But not to be crude, but I mean that literally, he did in fact defecate himself during the tasing. And later, Audrey told me that that's not really something that happens from being tased, so he must have just soiled himself in fear from being charged by multiple cops and the realization that he just shattered his probably most expensive replica sword against a 4th cop's shoulder. The cops took Cheese in, and while Audrey tried to tell me about the night he spent in the cell, I didn't really want to hear it. I kind of felt bad for the guy because there was something clearly wrong with his head. And the way me and Aud had grown up, our horrible trailer park mother and her string of drug dealer boyfriends, I know that sometimes while you can come out the other side a better person, there are other times where you end up broken. And that's exactly what Cheese's lawyers managed to argue. He wasn't of sound mind and he wasn't fit to stand trial. His living conditions were almost untenable and he was deemed a vulnerable individual. And as such, it was ruled that he wasn't fit to stand trial and instead spent an unknown amount of time in some mental health facility. Now, this wasn't years ago, so for all I know, he's still there. It was sad that he suffered, but I'm still a tiny bit skeptical that he had zero responsibility for his actions. Up until our very last encounter, he seemed to know what he was doing and what his plans were. And the only plus side to the whole thing was that Audrey gets to tell people that she was sliced by a samurai sword, And if people ask me to share a fun fact about myself, I tell them that I once dated an evil ninja. I'm 44 now, and this all went down exactly 10 years ago. And as much as I adore my son, I did think that I was kind of resigned to a life as a single father. Now, listeners, please don't crucify me, but in my experience, it's very hard for a single dad with a young male child to find a long-term partner. Maybe there's some scientific reason for this, or maybe I just get really unlucky. And I had it clear and visible on my profile that I had a wonderful 5-year-old son, and whenever I'd swipe right, they'd never swipe right back. Just for those worrying, he 100% knows that I don't blame him for this and never did. We've always been best friends, and he's an extremely smart kid. And on the rare occasions I did get a date, she almost always claimed that she didn't notice the sections where I had a son. Other times you could tell that she was gauging whether I'm hot enough to warrant raising somebody else's kid. No, was the answer apparently. Eventually, I gave up on dating apps and stopped bothering to look for a date at all. As it turns out, my son was staying with his grandparents one weekend, so me and my buddy Jesse decided to go bar hopping on a Friday night. Nothing crazy. We were 30-something-year-old men after all, and we certainly weren't going to hang out in clubs where the next oldest person was 22. But there's a surprisingly large amount of nightlife for the 30 to 40-year-olds in Chicago, and we found ourselves having a lot of fun, more than we'd expected. Now, eventually I met a woman who said that she was 28 and looked it too, and actually was. Sometimes people lie about their ages in places like this, but why bother? We all look and act our age, even if some age differently than others. Now, we ended up getting a little bit drunk and taking a taxi home. I was a gentleman and offered her my bed while I slept on the couch. Main rule, no drunken sex with someone I'm not married to. And the next day, we both woke up with hangovers and spent the whole day together. And I won't bore you with the details of our courtship, let's just jump to the important stuff. And the woman's name was Sheila. She'd moved in and served as the sort of surrogate mother to my son. And at first, everything was fine. She'd watch him sometimes, help with his homework, do a small share of chores that I used to do as a single dad. And eventually, though, she stopped doing really any of that. She wasn't looking for a job, and I was pretty much paying for everything. And she persuaded me to take a credit card out for us, which, against my better judgment, I did, not even questioning why she wasn't eligible herself. And I guess I was just, I don't know. She was in her 20s, attractive, I was in my 30s. She had a good relationship with my boy, and our intimate life was incredible. Who cared if she left a dish or plate or two lying around the house? It did start to grind me down, though, and when Christmas came, I realized that I'd have to borrow some money from my parents in order to be able to fully afford the item that my son wanted. I forgot what it was now, but we'll just pretend it's something really cool. It was mid-November when she broke the final straw. I came home to hear her yelling at my son that he was lazy and stupid for getting a B in English. I discussed with her multiple times that I had issues with his English teacher and her teaching methods, and that my son wasn't to be punished for a less than perfect grade in a subject. And yet here she was, yelling at him, telling him that Santa would be spending his money on Christmas presents for her instead. And then she threatened to smack his butt when he responded with, "You're not my mom." Now, if there's one thing I don't stand for is corporal punishment and threats of violence against my kid. And I stormed in and told Sheila to just leave. Now, she looked at me like she'd just come out of a trance, and then, much to my surprise, she agreed. She said it was for the best. She just asked if she could have until the weekend to pack all of her stuff together, which seemed reasonable. She'd fully moved in, so she had to fully move out as well. And that afternoon I was working in my office, and I've been able to do more remote work since Sheila, but I typically work from home so I could parent the boy. And I heard the front door opening, some muffled voices and shuffling, and then the door slamming shut. Eventually, I ended the call I was on and made it out into the apartment and saw it was empty and ran into the parking lot. I could see Sheila speeding up in her beat-up junker, and I could see my kid looking through the back window, tears streaming down his face. Immediately, I had to develop a plan. I'd get into my own car, chase Sheila, and drive erratically so the cops pulled me over and I could quickly tell them the situation. I knew I'd have to be careful because this wasn't exactly the quiet part of inner Chicago, and I didn't want to save my son but send some poor baby in a stroller to fly across the street in a deadly impact. And so I think my erratic driving, especially given my profession, more on that later, was more like slight misdemeanors than anything else. I followed Sheila around various corners, swerving around parked cars, speeding, trying to be as safe as possible. And the frustrating thing is, I caught sight of some cop cars a block over, but they didn't seem interested in me. I drove up, following Sheila, and saw the two cop cars and a van had her trapped in a street with another cop car blocking her from reversing. When I saw a female cop hugging my son, I dived out of the car and ran to him. He yelled "Daddy" in these excited tears, so the cops immediately knew to let me through. It turns out that two Chicago PD officers had both clocked me driving erratically and actually knew me. Now, I'm a stay-at-home prosecutor, so I'm not some stranger to a handful of cops. This pair knew that something had to be wrong, so they put a call out for any vehicle that a car with my registration might be pursuing, explaining that I was a junior prosecutor. A helicopter patrol easily identified Sheila's car as being the one that I was following, and they also ran a check and saw that she had multiple outstanding parking tickets in Chicago and a warrant in Iowa that they weren't willing to disclose. Later, I tried accessing her fine, but they'd restricted my access, but fair enough. Now, reunited with my son, I'd never been more happy or more scared. I realized then that losing him would be the most upsetting, devastating thing in my life. He just yelled, "Don't be lame, Dad," from the other side of the room, so I know I'm parenting right. And Sheila was charged with child endangerment and a series of other minor misdemeanors. Obviously, I wasn't allowed to serve as a prosecutor on the case for obvious reasons, but I wish I had. Her lawyers had managed to argue Sheila's way out of a kidnapping charge, and I'm still not happy about that. When she's released, though, she's being sent to Iowa to face whatever mysterious warrant she has waiting for her there. Like I said, I'm 44 now and I haven't dated since Sheila, and frankly, I don't want to. I have family and friends, and nobody could replace my boy's mom anyway, even though he sadly never got to know her as she passed during childbirth. Angela, I love you, and I'm certain that you're up in heaven and you helped keep our son safe that day. I know you'd want me to be happy too, whether that meant I dated again or not, but right now, I have everything in the world I could ask for. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul, and all links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, back to the lobby with you. More than 35 years ago now, back during the hunting season of 1992, my buddy Josh and I drove out to Belmont County to try and bag ourselves a couple of wild turkeys for Thanksgiving. and I remember it like it was yesterday. I was 22, he was 23, and we both had jobs in a mill down in Wheeling, him on the line and me hauling scrap. And the pay wasn't great, but it kept the lights on and fridge stocked, and since we each worked 4 on and 4 off, it gave us plenty of time to head off hunting once the season started. That year, I told my mom that I'd bring a turkey over on Thanksgiving morning so she could have it stuffed and roasted come dinner time. But then, like I said, to save a couple of bucks, we figured that we'd kill 2 birds with 1 stone and turn what should have been a grocery store run into a hunting trip. Now, I had this old 78 F-150 at the time, a total rust bucket, but tough as an old boot, too. So after loading it up with our shotgun and cooler full of beers and cold cuts, we hit the road before dawn, heading east out into the woods before the sun had even risen. Now, we got to where we planned to park the truck just after dawn, a spot at the end of a dirt road which petered off at a thick patch of woods. Now, we'd been out there the year before, and Belmont's got the most perfect mix of rolling hills and oak-rich forest, which mean there'd be plenty of acorns dropping to fatten up those turkeys. Look into it. It gives them this natural flavor that the store-bought ones, I'll tell you, are lacking. Now, we were walking and talking, sipping on some coffee as the birds started getting pretty noisy. Then about a mile in, we threw together a blind with some camo netting and a bunch of larger fallen branches. Now, I had a box call with me, one that my grandpa actually carved, so for the first hour or so I kept on letting out the odd yelp or cluck type of sound, trying to sound like a lonely young hen. But the most we got was a few squirrels rustling around or the occasional deer snort off in the distance. Josh ended up cracking a joke about how we'd end up having to shoot a possum and call it a turkey when we get home, but then not even a couple of minutes later, we heard that first gobble echo over from a ridge. Now finally, after what felt like forever of us just sitting there freezing our nuts off, we spotted a small flock scratching their way through the underbrush about 50 yards ahead of us. Me and Josh are as excited as 2 little kids on Christmas Eve, watching them get closer and closer, totally none the wiser that we're sitting there behind all that camo netting. We waited, and then we waited some more. And then right when the time was right, I brought up my 12 gauge and then made this one turkey drop like a sack of potatoes as I got a really fine hit on him. Josh got another, but mine had been the bigger Tom, strutting all proud with his feathers fanned and his beard swinging. But all it took was one pull of my trigger, and he flopped off in a puff of feathers. Now, we traded a few high fives, got to dragging these birds back to the truck, which made for one heck of a workout, as I'm sure you're familiar, and then started on the field dressing then and there, and then so we wouldn't have to mess with it back home. Now, we were knee-deep in feathers and guts, squatting by the birds and trying to get them cleaned up before the sun got too high and warmed things up, because Lord knows poultry smells like ass when the warm air starts getting to it. Now, Josh started talking about how gutting turkeys made him wish that we stuck to fishing, and how it's easier to gut certain kinds of fish than it is to get the wrapper off a Slim Jim. Now, that part made me laugh, and I turned to ask him what in the hell kind of Slim Jims he's been eating, but I didn't get a chance to get the words out, because before I even opened my mouth, a bullet flew over our heads and a shot rang out. Now, I think it was a tree that stopped the bullet, but I can't be certain. All I heard was this chunk sort of sound as it landed somewhere behind us. And both me and Josh just froze up for a second. And while I can't tell you what he was thinking at that moment, I couldn't imagine why anyone might shoot at us, so I assumed it was an accident of some kind. Now, we were both crouched still as I yelled out something, "What the hell? Hey, dumbass, watch your aim!" Now, I didn't really figure it was just some idiot greenhorn who couldn't tell a turkey call from the goddamn echo of one, and I expected to hear an apology, but instead, we got nothing. No answer at all. Just the wind rustling dead leaves. And then suddenly, another crack split the air, and a second bullet hit even closer than the first. When it kicked up a clump of dirt no more than 3 feet away from Josh's boot, we both screamed and ran for cover behind the truck. For a second, I thought I could run for my gun, which by then was leaning up against a log nearby. But I was also pretty sure grabbing it meant giving whoever was out there a very clear shot of me, so I realized pretty quickly that we had no choice but to stay crouched and hope the shooter didn't have an angle on us. Now, Josh kept trying to figure out where it was coming from, but it only took a couple of seconds for us to figure out that, at the very least, he wasn't behind us. He was somewhere out there in front of us and on the other side of that truck. Now, the best we could do was look out into the truck's side mirror and hope that we could catch a muzzle flash or something should the shooter choose to fire again. Josh leaned down at one point too, trying to peek out under the truck, but I told him to stop being so dumb before he got his freaking head shot off. He then tried reaching for his gun, and I swear I thought I was about to watch him take a bullet right then and there, but he managed to reach and grab it without the shooter firing a third time. And that's what gave us hope that whoever had fired had just simply ran off, so after a couple of more minutes of waiting there, we decided to make a break for it. We counted off a quiet 3, then scrambled up and dived into the truck, leaving those half-dressed turkeys laying there as we sped off as fast as we could. I didn't even think about going for my gun. Josh had his. And then while leaning over in the seat so as not to expose myself through the windshield, I started up the truck's engine, and off we went with the wheels spinning and not even bothering to close the doors. I kept waiting for a shot to shatter the windshield or ping off the tailgate, but there was nothing but the sound of my engine as we hauled ass down that dirt road. We didn't slow down until we hit the highway, but even then, it took another couple of miles before our hearts stopped pounding like they were fixing to explode. And we drove right over to the county sheriff's office, so wired on adrenaline and how surreal it all was that we forgot to wash the blood off of our hands. One of the deputies later joked that he thought we'd walk in to confess a murder and hadn't ever been so relieved in his life when we said it was turkey blood and he saw the little white feathers caked in the mud on our boots. Now, once we got as clean as we could in the department bathroom, we both sat down with the deputy I mentioned and walked him through the whole insane ordeal. It felt like talking about a dream, like it all happened so fast and it made such little sense that describing it all to that deputy felt almost like I was talking about someone else. The deputy took our statements, asked us a bunch of questions, mainly on the location of where it all happened, and that's when leaving the turkeys behind became a good thing, because if the cops found 2 half-dressed turkeys, then they had our spot. The deputy told us that they'd send a patrol out to check, but with it being hunting season, he was betting on it being anything from a stray bullet to some fool playing games. And to us, it felt way more personal than that. But we also figured that the sheriff's department would do a better job figuring it all out than we ever could. And I guess they did exactly that too, as it took them a couple of years. After we gave our statements, Josh and I grabbed some coffee at a gas station, and he talked me out of going back to where he'd been shot at so I could retrieve my shotgun. Although if I had chosen to go back, I'd have found what the deputies did a couple of days later, which was 2 half-dressed turkeys, but no shotgun. And that's what was real creepy, thinking whoever shot at us hadn't run off or run out of ammunition or whatever. They took 2 shots, then watched us drive off, all scared before walking up on where we'd been and stealing my gun. And the whole thing sure did ruin a good hunt, that's for damn sure, and my mother ended up buying a store-bought turkey which tasted like cardboard compared to what we could have had. Now it felt like we'd lost something even bigger than those turkeys and that shotgun. We just never realized how lucky we'd really been until about 3 years later. So, during the summer of 1993, a man named Thomas Dillon was convicted of 5 murders, all of which took place in eastern and southern Ohio. As you can imagine, it was huge news, but it wasn't the number of bodies or even where they killed which really got mine and Josh's attention. It was how this guy killed his victims. Because he didn't stab them or bludgeon them to death, he shot them instead. But he did it from a distance and with a long rifle, like he was hunting people. I heard it from Josh before I put it together myself, and when he called, it was the only time in my life where I genuinely felt my legs turn to jelly. I remember sitting back down on the couch with the phone in my hands thinking, holy crap, we got shot at by a serial killer, and we could have been 2 of his victims. Again, we didn't know how lucky we really were, because I think maybe 4 or 5 days later after our hunting trip, Tom Dillon killed a kid just a few years younger than us in almost the exact same spot. Now, he didn't just destroy lives by killing people either, and there's no way that he killed just 5. In fact, there was such a strong evidence that Dylan had killed 2 hunters in Michigan in the same year that we got shot at that another person falsely accused of killing them was let out of jail after spending 18 years in a cell. Now, that'll never fail to be crazy to me how this guy managed to ruin the lives of people he'd never even met, and how by some miracle I narrowly avoided being one of his victims. I grew up in a little town in Barber County, West Virginia during the late 50s and early 60s. Now, it was a lot like you might expect. Really poor, very family-oriented, and lots of Jesus Christ. There were a lot of backyard vegetable patches, people made a lot of homemade wine and liquor, and if you couldn't afford to put meat on the table, well, you went out and hunted it for yourself. I know of certain college towns that are crazy over football, but around here in Bellington and Alston, hunting was very much the local pastime. Now, I guess it carried on from the Great Depression, and it was very much a rite of passage for young men like myself to head out with their paws and grandpas and try to bag a deer. We learned hunting safety as early as elementary school and how you never went out into the woods during hunting season without blazing orange somewhere on your uppers. Now, we were also raised to have respect for the men who put their bodies on the line to feed their families and neighbors, because Lord knows you get a heck of a lot of meat out of a full-grown deer. And so when 2 hunters from around Bellington went missing back when I was 12, I remember it being a really big deal. My dad joined one of the search parties that went out looking for the 2 missing men, who turned out to be 2 regular hunting partners named Mo and Larry. Now, they used to get called the 2 Stooges on account of them lacking a curly, but no one made that joke after they disappeared. And after that, it was just poor Mo and Larry, or those missing hunters. Working with local cops, men from all over Barber County mounted 3 different search attempts, each one combing over the wooded hills near a place called Stringtown. Now, not a single trace of either hunter was ever found. We used to pray for them every Sunday in church, pray that they'd return home and safe and sound one day, having come back from wherever they were. But after a while, folks started to accept the cold, hard truth that both Mo and Larry were probably dead. As a kid, I remember finding it all very confusing. There was no sign of what you might call foul play, which gave folks a lot of hope. And then when the searchers didn't find any bodies, people started talking like Mo and Larry were just on vacation or decided to leave town for some reason. Now, I remember why they'd do something like that, just up and leave town without telling anybody. And there were all kinds of rumors too, just nothing anybody talked about in public and nothing that fit neither. But then one day, there was suddenly a little memorial outside the church, and I saw Mo and Larry's families all dressed in black on 2 consecutive weekends. One day they were just off someplace, then the next, they were gone for good. This was many years after they went missing, and I later learned that Mo and Larry's families decided to declare them dead in absentia for legal and financial reasons. But doing that meant giving up on them and accepting that they were gone. And then, when the town finally accepted that Mo and Larry were really dead, and not just missing, it was like this whole second wave of grief that I remember much clearer on account of being older. Now, I guess it was how everyone was feeling for Mo and Larry's kids, because they left 2 widows, but 5 orphans. It twisted people up inside to see so many kids grieving like that, having all that hope ripped away from them after it kept them warm for so many years. And then people got bitter and mad and started looking for someone or something to blame. Now, I was at a town meeting when someone suggested the volunteer search teams hadn't done their jobs properly, and all hell broke loose. There was a lot of yelling back and forth, and I remember Dad switching from beer to whiskey that evening as he sat on the porch watching the night roll on. He was talking to just about anyone who'd listen, and he told me all about how there was something off about how the search went on. How Mo and Larry should have been boots on the ground, but how it was just like they just hopped in a truck and took off somewhere. Now, that wasn't out of the question, but the issue of why bothered some more than others. Some of those nasty rumors I mentioned involved Mo and Larry batting for the other team, so to speak, meaning some treated the disappearance like it was radioactive and didn't want to touch it. But then other folks, my dad included, had a way more frightening idea, one that involved poor Mo and Larry being forced into said truck against their will, as in, at gunpoint. According to my dad, all liquored up on the porch that night, there was no way in hell either man would just abandon their wives and kids like that, not without at least a note on the kitchen table. And if they'd been murdered out there, there'd be some shred of evidence to prove that they weren't all in one piece, be it a scrap of clothing or a scrap of them. And then according to my pop, anyone who said he and his boys didn't look hard enough were liars, because they turned over every leaf in those woods looking for Mo and Larry twice over, and they didn't find squat. It was just a real sad state of affairs, and the whole thing hung over the town for years and years and years. And then one day, the county sheriff comes to visit Mo and Larry's widows and starts asking them all kinds of questions about any business that they might have had with two farmers over in Tucker County. Neither widow knew what they were talking about, so they had nothing to share. But when they asked if there had been any developments in their search for their missing husbands, the sheriff gave them chicken feed, and that he was just talking to some farmers over there in Tucker about the disappearances. Well, he wasn't just talking to anyone over in Tucker. He was working with the sheriff's office over there and digging up whole patches of land on this hog farm owned by these two brothers. It took a couple of days for word to spread across county lines, but when it did, someone from Alston drove over to see it for themselves. Lo and behold, the cops were all still there, stripped to the waist with shovels and pickaxes, shoveling their way through mountains of dirt. They were looking for something all right, and by that stage, it had to be Mo and Larry's bodies. But since they refused to make any announcements regarding what they were doing, there was an uproar back home in Bellington. Folks wanted to know what the hell they were doing out there, digging up some hog farm, or more specifically, what kind of tip-off they'd received that led them to put all that work into digging the place up. It was radio silence for weeks on end, and then when the Barber County Sheriff finally told folks what he was doing, they were even less happy than before. He said it was some kind of anonymous tip-off and that the whole dig had amounted to nothing, but people didn't believe a word of it. They didn't believe that they'd dig up a whole farm based on nothing but a tip. But the cops wouldn't budge. They said that there was nothing more to be done regarding that avenue of investigation, and there'd be more updates as and when they rolled in. But there were no updates, there was no news, and neither Mo nor Larry, bodies or otherwise, were ever found. The mystery of what happened to those two hunters stayed hanging over Bellington for as long as I lived there, and since I don't imagine people have forgotten about them, I don't imagine that dark cloud's about to disappear anytime soon. In what was very much a spur-of-the-moment decision, I decided to join the British Army when I was 18. I'd fallen in with a bad group of lads back home, and after almost dying on the road one night while we were all drunk, I knew something had to change. Now, the Army should have given my dad a recruitment bounty because it was him that talked me into it. I could learn some discipline, get fit, earn a wage, and shoot a few guns while I was at it, and that was all he needed to say. I ended up an infantryman in the Cheshires, which is what we called the Cheshire Regiment at the arse end of the Cold War. It was all Russia, Russia, Russia back then, so not much has changed, I suppose. But then the USSR fell apart, and suddenly we had no one to fight. Things were looking up, and for young soldiers like myself, it seemed like we'd be spending the rest of our careers in peacetime. But then, not even a year after the USSR went tits up, another Eastern European country decided to crap the bed, and this time, it was Yugoslavia. Now, long story short, Yugoslavia was a country made up of people who hated each other's guts, and the only thing keeping a lid on it all was a dictatorship. But then when that fell apart, everything kicked off. There were massacres, sieges, bombings, you name it. And then the UN decided a peacekeeping force should go in to stop it, and that's how we ended up in a place called Sarajevo. Being the biggest city in all of Bosnia, it had the highest concentration of people in the whole country living there, and when the war kicked off, it was immediately surrounded by Serbian forces. They tried to take the city, but the Serb assault force was massively outnumbered by the Bosnian defenders, so the assault failed. And that's when the siege started, and it didn't let up for almost 4 years. By the time we arrived, Sarajevo was one of the most dangerous places on planet Earth. There were rocket and mortar barrages, both incoming and outgoing, sniper duels between Serbs and Bosnians, and sometimes both water and power would be shut off for weeks at a time, which made the city smell like an unwashed arse in the summer. It was hell on earth, and it was impossible for your heart not to break for the civilians forced to live there. People lost family every single day, like when the Serbs sent a single 120mm mortar shell into a crowded marketplace one day. More than 200 people were either hurt or killed just from that one little shell, and the Serbs did it on purpose. Their snipers had the same strategy and didn't restrict themselves to uniformed soldiers or even armed civilians. If they could see you, you were fair game, and I'll never ever forget watching a Serb sniper gun down this lone elderly woman as she tried to cross the street one day. The shelling was horrendously scary, but the Serbs were using old Soviet kits, so for the most part, it wasn't very accurate. But the thing we really worried about were the snipers, especially the good ones. They could get much closer than the mortar or rocket crews, and I'd say about 50% of the time, if they had you in their sights, you were done for. And it's a story about a sniper that I've got for you today. So, in April of 1993, my section and I had been given the job of guarding an intersection in our 2 armored vehicles. Jobs like that are usually quite boring. This one was the polar opposite. And aside from the already 300 artillery and mortar shells which hit Sarajevo on a daily basis, the snipers were incredibly ballsy. But while me and my section mates were safe in our armored cars, civilians, especially the old or infirm, were incredibly vulnerable to their fire. We kept watch, but it was also our job to provide mobile cover to civilians should they come under fire. Then, if possible, and without undue danger to innocent life, we would return fire until the incoming ceased and the snipers fled. Where we were stationed, we managed to identify 4 different snipers based on the location of their firing points and the caliber of ammunition they used. It wasn't a foolproof method, like they didn't shoot at us and we'd be like, "Oh, that's Dave," but we could usually figure it out pretty quickly. So when one day we had someone open up on us from a brand new firing point in a derelict high-rise, we reckoned that a brand new player had joined the game, and he must have been brand new because his shooting was shite. The first time this new sniper shot at us, we didn't think it actually was directed at us. It wasn't until the second shot landed a bit closer that we realized that we were the target. We did our usual thing and returned fire after identifying the fire point. Now, all it took was a bit of machine gun fire, and then our checkpoint went quiet again. The next day, the same thing happened again, and we got shot at from the same place, and the shots were so inaccurate that we honestly felt embarrassed for whoever was up there pulling the trigger. But then the third day, the snipers started targeting civilians and not just our armored cars. So with one of us providing cover, the other car rushed off towards what turned out to be the derelict apartment building to flush out that sniper. I was with the car who stayed back to provide cover to the civilians, so I didn't get to see all of this. But the lads in the other car said that when they found the abandoned apartment the sniper had been using, it was empty. There were casings all over the floor, alongside a small hole in the wall that overlooked our position. So while they might have been a terrible shot, they were pretty good at picking fire points, meaning it was only a matter of time before a bullet finally hit its target. Knowing the situation was akin to a ticking time bomb here, with a derelict high-rise being much closer than the surrounding hills, our sergeant asked our troop commander if we should set up a listening post in an adjacent flat. A car full of lads could sneak up there before dawn, take a concealed position up, and then when the snipers fired, boom, they'd pounce. When the boss okayed it, we were chuffed to the bits. We'd been sitting on our arses getting shot at for weeks, and with F all to show for it, so, as you can imagine, we were well up for getting our own back. Now, the next morning, the wagons arrived at the checkpoint, but only mine was occupied. The other only had its driver because the lads who normally occupied it had their listening post set up in the high-rise. We waited, and we waited, checking in with each other every so often. Then around 11 that morning, our radio man up in the listening post started tapping on his receiver. And none of us needed to figure out the code that he was tapping out to know someone was in the building with them. We were all on tenterhooks waiting for something to happen, and when it did, we were relieved to hear none of our blokes were hurt after the shooting stopped. Our lads up in the high-rise had taken down 2/3 of a 3-man sniper team, most likely belonging to a Serb militia by the looks of them. The third, who was unarmed, dropped to his knees and begged for his life. And seeing as a prisoner would be handy, the lads brought him back to the checkpoint with his arms tied behind his back. But before that, we heard something over the radios that had us right shocked. So, after our lads killed 2/3 of the sniper team, then took the third bloke prisoner, they searched the bodies of the 2 dead men to see what they had on them. They had a bit of money on them, cigarettes, lighters, bits and pieces like that. But then in the pocket of one dead man, our section mates found a passport. An Italian passport. They obviously compared the picture to the dead man's face just to make sure it was really him. But there was no mistake. The now deceased sniper did indeed seem to be an Italian citizen, and not one of Serbian extraction either, if his name was anything to go by. The Serb we captured had a load of cash on him, so at first we thought the Italians might have been mercenaries of some description. But once we got hold of someone who spoke Serbian to act as a translator, the captured Serb told a very different story. It was one I didn't believe at the time, but after seeing the article I've attached to this email, I realized that he might well have been telling the truth all along. Through the translator, and having sweetened him up with some ciggies, water, and a little ration packs, our Serb prisoner was only too willing to tell us what was going on. And when he did, we were shocked. The 2 Italians hadn't been mercenaries, which made sense since the Serbs weren't exactly flush with cash. Instead, it was them that had been paying the Serbs for a chance to shoot at UN soldiers and Bosnian civilians. And we couldn't believe our ears, and neither could our translator, because at one point, their expression went from deadpan to very, very confused. We asked the woman to double-check for us and get the man to confirm that what he was organizing was effectively war tourism. The Serb said that he was just following orders and had no choice but to do as his commander told him, or it'd be him who got a bullet. He couldn't tell us much about the Italians that he was escorting, only that they had a lot of money with them and they knew absolutely sod all about soldiering. My words, not his. Now, when all was said and done, we had little choice but to report evidence of war tourism to our troop commander. He was shocked, just as we'd been, especially once we showed him the Italian passport we'd found on the dead man. But frustratingly, we needed a lot more than just one man's word and a passport to prove an accusation like war tourism, and that's aside from the fact that it's not strictly a war crime. Our sergeant asked if it was worth going back to collect the 2 men's bodies, but our troop commander didn't think it was worth the risk. If it was true, and those 2 Italians were tourists paying good money to kill people, then they'd already received the most suitable punishment possible. Our lieutenant also said that there was very little chance the Italians would even claim them. They'd say the passports were forged, that no good Italian would ever do such a thing, and they might actually be right too. The passports might have been forged, and the blokes we'd killed had actually been Russian advisors or something, but that contradicted what the Serb prisoner had told us, but the boss was basically right. We didn't actually know anything about the 2 blokes that had been killed in the high-rise, and there were much more pressing matters at hand than identifying 2 idiots who strayed into a war zone. And that's where it stayed. Officially nothing but rumor for more than 30 years, and then an old mate of mine sent me the Al Jazeera article that I've included in this email, and my jaw just about hit the floor. I suppose I should briefly summarize what it says so your audience knows what I'm on about. But long story short, there's an Italian journalist who's gathered so much evidence of what he calls sniper safaris that an Italian prosecutor had brought the case to court. The journalist reckons it was advertised among darker corners of Italian society, most likely with mafia involvement, and that participants paid what today would be worth about 100,000 euros, or about $120,000 US. Now, we weren't the only soldiers to notice it happening either, because according to that Italian journo, a Bosnian intelligence officer reached out to his Italian counterparts and asked them to put a stop to it. People in Sarajevo had apparently long suspected that there had been sniper safaris, as in foreigners paying vast amounts for the chance to shoot at them. One person quoted in the article says that the snipers always seem more active on weekends, which implies people flying over on the Friday and then leaving again on the Sunday evening, which is exactly what an unnamed plastic surgeon was said to have done back in 1993, the same year I was there. The article doesn't mention anything about any tourists losing their lives, but I suppose it's implied, isn't it? Not all the rounds were incoming. We fired back quite a few at the Serbs from inside Sarajevo, so I wouldn't be surprised if even more sniper safaris came under fire and ended up paying $100,000 for the privilege of losing their lives. Unsurprisingly, I don't have much sympathy for them. It was us that they were shooting at, but having it all but confirmed for us gave me mixed feelings. I suppose I just didn't want to think about people being capable of stuff like that. People who saw a terrible tragedy unfolding and thought, I can take advantage of that. And it's not just about making money on war, though that is bad enough, but to be capable of taking someone's life, a total stranger at that, and then getting away with it, scot-free. Bonjour. My name is Laurent, and I'm from Charleroi here in Belgium, and I believe I have a story you may be interested in. Now, it's not a personal story of a frightening experience, but rather a story that is personal to me that frightens me very much to even think about. Now, perhaps that is my English failing me, in which case I beg your pardon. But all will become clear as this email progresses, and I promise it'll be worth your time to read. My grandfather, Leandro, was born in 1899 and spent his formative years being educated or working on my great-grandfather's farm. He planned on attending university with an aim of becoming a doctor, but the Great War changed many destinies. He was too young to serve in the army during the First War, then volunteered as a junior officer shortly prior to the outbreak of the Second. Yet the speed at which Germany invaded Belgium meant that his unit was overrun and he was forced to flee to Britain to become part of the Free Belgian Forces. His dream was to be present in the army that retook his homeland, but instead, the government in exile had other plans and sent him to the Congo. Now, despite its motherland being overrun by Germans, the Belgian colony of the Congo remained in Free Belgian hands. Yet the government was in dire need of people to aid in the country's colonial administration, which is why my grandfather was given the job. He traveled to the Congo in 1940, spent 5 years living and working there, and then when the war ended and it was time to return home, my grandfather refused. He claimed to have not only found a home away from home, but also a private enterprise by which he could richly support himself, and that of a hunting guide. Grandpa was based in a place called Kisangani, which is a city in the eastern portion of Congo's central basin that is surrounded by dense rainforests and jungles. Many wealthy Belgian and French hunters used to visit Kisangani and would pay vast amounts to hunting guides who could safely lead hunts for forest buffalo, red-coasted bongo, or the semi-aquatic Sitatunga antelope. Now, my grandfather had been an avid hunter both at home and in the Congo. So after risking his life for the freedom and liberty of all, he decided a life of leisure was in order and began a hunting enterprise so he could profit from his passions. My father and aunt would travel out to visit him in the winter times, and they witnessed firsthand how their father funded their lavish lifestyles back home in Charleroi. Now, my grandfather hosted a great number of Belgian and French celebrities, as well as diplomats and foreign dignitaries. He would throw extravagant parties with drinks and dancing after returning upriver with his clients from the hunting grounds. I have seen many photographs from those times, and to me he seemed like a happy, fun-loving, and remarkably unserious person. But that all ended in 1960 when a period of violent instability culminated in the Congo gaining independence from colonial rule. Many Belgians returned to their motherland, including my grandfather, but according to my father, his return marked a dramatic shift in his personality. Gone was the fun-loving, field sports-loving socialite who hunted by day and partied by night, and instead, a dour and bitter man had taken his place. My father and aunt were grown-ups by this time and didn't live in the large family home anymore, but they heard stories from my grandmother regarding the change in her husband's demeanor. He would sequester himself in his study for days on end, sleeping and taking his meals there too, and for months he lived like that, studying thick tomes and poring over maps before he finally shared the details of his affliction with my grandmother. Now, for the previous year, a business partner of his had gone missing in the field, and since the struggle for independence had slowed the process of his recovery, my grandfather had been forced to organize the search effort from thousands of miles away, and the process was clearly taking its toll. My grandmother didn't press him on the subject, but as the effort to recover his business partner stretched into 1961 and 1962, it was clear that the search was no longer for a living person, but potentially for their body. But then, in early 1963, my grandfather seemed to become very excited after obtaining new evidence of his partner's whereabouts. He flew to Congo just weeks later and spent around 10 weeks in the jungle searching for his partner. My grandmother said she prayed nightly for his success, and upon receiving news of his failure, she prayed that he would find a way to live with it. Yet instead of returning home in grief, having written an end to yet another sad and chaotic period of his life, his return marked the beginning of a brand new one, marked by madness, superstition, and social withdrawal. He began importing Minkisi statuettes from the Lengola tribespeople who inhabit the lands east and south of Kisangani. He imported them by the dozens, the quantity of which I have witnessed with my own eyes, but Minkisi are not mere decorative pieces. In fact, they have sometimes been described as portable graves. If a person takes even a clump of soul from the grave of a deceased person and passes it over or places it inside of a Minkisi, then the soul of the deceased can travel wherever the statue goes. Grandpa Leandro has these Minkisi guardians installed over windows and doors, but never explained whether this was to keep something in or to keep something out of his house. Now, my grandfather also oversaw the installation of what he called an ancestral altar in his study, but this he chose to explain. He kept it stocked with offerings like fresh water and fruits, or drew symbols on it in red chalk so that the spirits of the dead might linger and offer him guidance. My grandfather also kept bowls of river stones in his home and ordered a pond to be dug on his lands so that Simbi water spirits might make their home there. The Simbi are spirits which guard nature and ferry souls between life and death. Perhaps it was his advanced age that sparked such a fascination with them, but each of the fountains, bird baths, and even some of the water taps in his home bore images of Simbi. Yet I think it was their reputation for warning of danger which truly occupied my grandfather's mind. And that was how he spent his final years, fixated on antediluvian Congolese religion and living out his study like some kind of wealthy hermit. My grandmother said that, at first, Grandpa Leandro would only draw his strange chalk symbols around the ancestral altar in his study, but as he drew closer and closer to death, they began appearing in other areas of their home and with increasing frequency. But unlike the red symbols, which he believed invoked good health and longevity, these later symbols were only ever in white, which denoted communication with the spirit world. He grew more and more agitated as his health began to fail him. The presence of owls on his property frightened him terribly, since he firmly believed that they were an omen of death. My grandmother said that in the days before Grandpa Leandro passed, he seemed incredibly agitated and scatterbrained. He began demanding that she summon what he called a nanga, which is essentially a Congolese witch doctor, so they might perform death rites on him. My grandmother suffered terribly in her belief that her husband's mind was fracturing, but did as he wished, and found a nanga in form of an elderly Congolese housemaid who lived in Brussels. My grandmother feared the woman's presence would only further agitate her dying husband, but instead, he appeared calm and lucid as the nanga chanted and performed her rituals. My grandmother said it was a transformation, Whatever that woman said or did with him, it brought a frightened and paranoid man to peace, and then a few days later, he died. I was in my early 20s when he passed away, and until then, I had been shielded from most of his madness with the explanation that he was very eccentric and very ill. But after he died and my grandmother could no longer maintain the veneer of wellness, I found out everything I've written about and more in a whirlwind week of revelations. Now, as you can probably tell, I ended up doing a great deal of my own personal research into my grandfather's beliefs in the hopes that it might shed some light on the man's mind. But for every answer I obtain prompts only more questions and only deepens the mystery. My grandfather was something of a documentarian in his way, and I have already touched on the photo albums full of pictures of his lavish parties and prominent hunting clients. Now, he also kept many diaries of his service in the Congo, both private and public. But when it comes to information regarding his missing business partner, a South African gentleman named Francois, there was a frustrating and rather alarming absence. I found plenty of maps and invoices regarding the transportation of expeditionary equipment, but absolutely nothing on the circumstances of Francois' disappearances, or what happened on the attempt to recover him, which took place in 1963. Discovering what happened on this trip is nothing short of pivotal to explaining my grandfather's beliefs and his state of mind, yet I am at a complete loss to explain it. And in the absence of explanations, I find myself entertaining some very frightening ideas. My grandfather was a great man, and for a time he was a happy one, but something happened to one of his oldest and closest friends, and I don't think it was the mystery of it that drove my grandfather mad. I think it was the truth. I think something horrifying beyond reason happened to my grandfather's friend, something that only ancient religion and superstition could bring him comfort. And despite my best efforts to uncover what that thing is, I find myself wondering, do I really want to know the truth? The same truth which stole his sanity. I've been an employee of the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission for almost 10 years now, and while I love my job, it's hard going sometimes. Now, to cut a long story short, we're the agency responsible for taking care of the state's wildlife, along with the various habitats that they call home. Now, it's also our job to issue licenses to hunters that we deem safe and responsible, and we handle a lot of the educational materials regarding stuff like hunting and boating safety. Now, we also run conservation programs to ensure the state's natural beauty can be enjoyed for generations to come. But it's not all rubber stamps and giving lectures to elementary school kids. There's a dark side to the job, and that dark side mostly consists of investigating hunting accidents. Our wildlife officers investigate reports of animal attacks, but also accidents like tree stand falls, and then we try to integrate what we learn into prevention programs so repeat incidents don't occur. But in more severe cases, especially those involving criminal negligence, which, God forbid, result in fatalities, we coordinate with local law enforcement for more thorough probes. Now, I've been unfortunate enough to have been involved in about 24 investigations of that nature, and each and every one of them involving serious injury or loss of life were both physically and mentally challenging. But there's only one such incident that manages to send shivers down my spine, even all these years later, and it's this one. Just over 6 years ago, we got a call one day from the Marion County Sheriff's Department saying that there had been a real nasty hunting accident up near a place called Yellville. Accidents are rare, so we were shocked just to get a call like that, but once we heard the details, we just about had to pick up our damn jaws off the floor afterwards. Apparently, there had been 2 hunters out in the woods, and they'd been stalking this old buck for hours and hours. They'd noticed it had been acting a little funny while they'd been trailing it, but nothing too out of the ordinary, so they kept on its tail till they had themselves a decent shot. Now, one of the hunters lines up his sights, takes his shot, and the buck goes down. But then instead of walking straight over there to take their pictures and haul it away, they stopped, watched, and waited. You see, hunters can't just walk up to their kills after they go down because sometimes the deer is just stunned and can wake up and choose violence as soon as the hunters start poking and prodding around. Our safety briefs advise folks to wait at least 20 to 30 minutes, depending on the size of the animal and where the shot landed. This way they can ensure their prey is passed on and won't be a threat to them during trophy pictures or transportation. Our 2 hunters up near Yellville weren't cowboys either, so I believe them when they said that they waited for the full 30 before approaching their kill. And then after standing over it for a minute or so and making damn sure that the thing wasn't breathing anymore, they started fixing to take some pictures. But then no sooner had one of the hunters kneeled down behind it, the buck that they were quite certain was dead suddenly leapt to its feet and gored the man closest to it really, really bad. He suffered 3 very serious puncture wounds to his stomach and chest, and since it was all close quarters chaos, his buddy didn't have the time or the accuracy to shoulder his rifle and try to put the buck down again. Luckily, the thing took off just as fast once it gored the guy to the ground, so he didn't receive any additional injuries. But unfortunately, his buddy's shot missed. Now, I never rejoice when an animal is killed. It was frustrating not getting our hands on its body so we could further analyze it and potentially figure out how it appeared to come back to life all aggressive like that. A lot of figuring out what's going on with flora or fauna ends up in a lab, so no samples meant no answers. But the most important thing was that our wounded hunter was airlifted to a hospital where the doctors managed to save his life. Now, some said it was nothing short of a miracle considering the damage that buck's antlers had done. But if you notice, folks never seem to question the miracles. It's always the mysteries that keep them up at night. And the mystery in this case was how in the world that buck had jumped to its feet after 2 experienced hunters were so sure that it was dead. Now, after we talked with the wounded hunter and his partner, I was one of the wildlife officers dispatched to the scene. It was eerie as all heck out there, just knowing that we were in a place where something like that had happened. But since the buck in question was already shot, we figured it'd only be a matter of time before we found it laid out somewhere, dead as a doornail. But we searched for hours, up and down in every direction, and we didn't find so much as a pile of poop. And that didn't make a lick of sense. Now, our wounded hunter said that his aim was good, and he put a bullet through both that buck's lungs. But if that was the case, now we should have found it dead within less than a mile of the incident site. Now, by the end of our search, me and the other wildlife officers had ourselves a really bad case of the willies, wondering how in the world the supposedly dead buck had the strength to inflict such damage to our hunter and then ran off without keeling over after only a couple of steps. One of the tasks that we were issued after the fact was to figure out how we could incorporate lessons into our hunter education programs and habitat management strategies to hopefully help prevent similar tragedies. But when it came to it, I had no idea what in the hell I was going to write. The hunters did exactly what we asked in terms of giving their prey a wide berth after their kill. So apart from something akin to try not to shoot one of them, their zombie deers, there was nothing much I could say in terms of safety or prevention. All we were left with were a series of unanswered questions, and pretty damn creepy ones at that. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. So many years ago, my parents still lived in the house that I grew up in as a child. The neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Morse, stuck out to me as a kid as a regimental, stern couple. Now, Mr. Morris was the type of man you can only describe as blustering, and Mrs. Morris was sort of like a human square, with a bowl haircut and a mustache almost as bushy as her husband. Now, if this sounds like being uncharitable to them, hell yeah, I definitely am, and you'll hate these two by the end of the story as well. Unless you're a psychopath, in which case, may I suggest that you live in a cabin in the woods without neighbors. The Morrises were sternly friendly with my parents, while me and my siblings grew up. They had this son, August, who was in the Scouts with my elderly brother Barry, and he was sort of like a mini version of his father. Bossy, always demanding to be the leader of the activities, and would become quietly red-faced angry if things didn't go his way. Us kids in the neighborhood had a nickname behind his back, and that of a certain Austrian dictator that I don't think you're allowed to say on YouTube, but let's just say that he's someone that you will not see very often. Now anyway, the son isn't the point here. He was sent off to military boarding school at some point during high school, and the wild thing is that he bragged about asking to be sent there. And so we just grew up around the Morrises, who were pretty stern but polite and mostly just sort of kept to themselves. Occasionally they'd complain if our music was too loud or if we had a barbecue that ran past 9 p.m. And if any of mine or my siblings' balls went into the neighbor's garden or over the boundary hedge, well, you could kiss that goodbye. They would return it, but they would puncture it. My dad asked them why they did this once, and they claimed that the balls always hit some sharp object in their garden, and there was nothing they could do about it. What, was their garden made of spiked pits or something? Now, eventually my brother Barry moved out for college, and then a couple of years later so did I, and then a couple of years after that, Andy moved out to go traveling. And that just left my parents and our much, much younger sibling Sammy, who was only 10 when I was 20. Now one day, my mom FaceTimed me in tears telling me that they were being taken to court by the Morrises. And when I got her to calm down and Dad joined the call, they explained that they'd received a legal letter from the neighbors explaining that our boundary hedge had been encroaching on their land for years, and that my family owed them over $400,000 in reparations for lost revenue for use of the land as expansion for an unspecified business. Now, the reason they called me first was because I was studying law at the time. Immediately, this rang a million alarm bells in my head, and I asked them what distance the hedge was supposedly encroaching on the neighbor's land, and they very meekly told me 1 inch. And I asked them to scan the letter and send it over. I did some research, called a few friends, and discovered that, much as I suspected, the law firm representing the Morrises not only was not reputable, but in fact, entirely imaginary. The Morrises had invented their own law firm and sent a fake threatening letter. And my biggest confusion was why. It was obvious that my parents wouldn't just pay $400,000 without seeking legal counsel. And the answer came a couple of days later when a second letter from the fraudulent law firm arrived. They presented an offer that the bill would be dropped if my parents would agree to shift the boundary hedge 10 feet back, granting a much larger boundary to the neighbors as a sort of cost-free compensation to avoid any monetary demands. Now, this was something that, knowing my parents, if they didn't have a daughter who was a lawyer in training, they may have agreed to that just for a quiet life. Now, I worked it out using some land blueprints and contacted the relevant offices and discovered that the Morrises had applied for an extension to their house and purchased a prefab guest house, but both projects would require them to encroach into my parents' land. And so at the time, I happened to be dating an older guy, who's now my husband, who worked for a law firm specializing in this kind of thing. And he did some digging and checked out some old records, and it turned out that the boundary hedge was in fact around a foot into my parents' property, meaning if anything, the Morrises had been encroaching on our land this entire time. My boyfriend drafted an actual legitimate legal document stating this with the relevant proof, and the letter ended with a confirmation that my family was simply letting things be as long as the Morrises did the same to avoid any kind of escalation. We hoped that being caught red-handed would cause these fools to drop their lies. Clearly, we underestimated just how badly they wanted their extension, or how much money they dropped on this back garden prefab, presumably non-refundable. However, their next move didn't take the form of fake lawyers or legal threats at all. Instead, my parents started receiving notes written like ransom letters, with the letters cut out of various magazines. I'm not joking. They made strange, bizarre threats, such as a promise to kill our pet miniature donkey, something we never even owned, and another letter threatened to poison the koi in our pond. We don't have a pond or koi. The letters were so ridiculous that my parents kept copies, but didn't report them to the police, not at first. But then they became threatening. My parents wouldn't show me the notes directly, but they let slip that the notes names myself and my brothers. And then finally, a note arrived promising that Sammy would never arrive home from school one day when they least expected it, which is when they finally went to the cops. And of course, the cops couldn't prove that the notes came from the Morrises. This harassment went on for 5 years. Acts of petty vandalism, weird pieces of graffiti on the walls of the house, hoses were clipped in the middle of the night with the faucet running so the yard flooded, dead birds and roadkill being left on the doorstep, and the Morrises, these clever idiots, obviously made themselves the victims of their own harassment too, so suspicion didn't fall on them. And then the fires started. Just small, contained fires in the backyard that scorched the lawn. Another classic was that the Morrises would play classical music at full volume at 3:33 a.m. in the morning every single Wednesday. And when it was time for Sammy's exams, they escalated it to every day. My parents filed noise complaints, but the Morrises denied any involvement and, in fact, claimed that they hated classical music. And when investigators were there, somehow they mysteriously managed to know and the music didn't play on those nights. My eldest brother moved home and in no uncertain terms threatened the Morrises. The C words had the gall to call the cops on him, and this further undermined our claims against them. They went so far as to try and suggest that my brother was the one committing the vandalism, despite the fact that he'd been living in a totally different state during most of the incidents and had an alibi for most of it. Now Sammy, meanwhile, was becoming an absolute wreck, and we all felt so hopeless, and it felt like the whole world was against us. In the end, the entire family got together for a family meeting, and we very tearfully decided that the only recourse that we had was to move out of our family home that had been in the family since my mom's childhood. So that's what we did. We put the house up for sale, my parents accepted the first offer they received, and they moved into a smaller house that, realistically, was more manageable for them, especially once Sammy went away to college. There's no happy ending here, really, at least not for us. The lesson is simply that sometimes it's better to walk away than let your entire life be taken up with fighting the fight, even if it is a just and good one. There is an ending, though, but I can't say it's a good one, and as much as I hated the Morrises for what they put us through, I wouldn't wish this on anyone. Remember their son, who willingly went to military school and we nicknamed that Austrian painter? Well, it turns out that Augie had been thrown out of military school, then dishonorably discharged from the military, all without his parents' knowledge. He'd fallen into drugs and violence, and one day, he came home. Augie held his parents at gunpoint with a sawed-off shotgun, zip-tied them back-to-back to dining chairs, and then he and a couple of associates robbed the Morrises of every valuable they could get their hands on, and then, as a parting gift, with the butt of that sawed-off, he shattered both of his father's kneecaps. Nobody knows what caused Augie to hate his parents so much. It's probably not hard to guess, but when he was caught, he kept quiet. And he was caught a few days later as he admitted to what he'd done, but not why he'd done it. He was sent to prison for quite a few years, and Mrs. Morris died shortly after, poetically said to have died of a broken heart. Mr. Morris spent the rest of his years in a hospice, unable to walk, and also never uttered a single word again since that night. And so the new neighbors who bought our family home never had to deal with the neighbors from hell, and the whole story is a reminder of just how completely messed up and pointless the motivations of some people can be, how they can live with themselves when they all cause so much pain, and how when you cause pain to others, sometimes it returns to you tenfold. I don't know if I believe in karma, but in this case, I can't help but feel that no matter how much the Morrises screwed with my family, they got far more than they deserved, and I can only hope their son, Augie, can one day find some peace. Long-time listener, first-time writers, they say, and this happened about a year ago, and holy F, I never thought something this messed up would happen to me and my family. So it all started when my parents, both recently retired, decided to use their part of their life savings to go away on a 6-month world cruise. Not really my jam, but they were psyched about it and I was psyched for them. And even better, the lease on my apartment was up the week before they left, so I was free to house sit for them the entire time they were gone. This was a relief to my mom, who would have spent the whole cruise in a state of neurosis, calling me or my brother to check on the house every 5 minutes. And knowing that I was living there ironically meant that she wouldn't worry at all. Oh, Mother, if only you'd known. In the week before they left, as I moved my things into my old childhood bedroom ready for the next 6 months, my mom gave me the rundown of the house as if I hadn't grown up there. I barely paid attention to all the things that she was telling me. Yes, Mom, I know where the fridge is, I know the Wi-Fi password, I know how to use the TV. I know the guest room is filled with Aunt Joni's art while she's between husbands, and that I must not dispose of any of it. What I didn't know about, though, was the new neighbor. His name was Mr. Samuels, and he moved in a few months previously. If you believe my mom, Mr. Samuels was an angel sent from heaven. He was the loveliest, sweetest old person, Mom said, despite the fact that he was only a couple of years older than my dad. Now, he baked cakes for the neighbors, so I shouldn't be surprised if he dropped by with some muffins or maybe even some red velvet cake. I admit, I do like a good red velvet cake, so maybe Mr. Samuels was okay by me. Mr. Samuels had a nurse who came by every other day, so I didn't need to worry about him apparently, not that I'd been planning to. Mom did enough worrying for the whole family. I didn't actually see Mr. Samuels before my parents left for their cruise because he was away staying with one of his kids. And so I bid my parents farewell at the docks, waving a handkerchief and sobbing like a wartime bride. Not really, but then headed back to the house, ready for 6 months of hardcore freelance art commissions and watching all the subscription services that my parents subscribed to and I didn't want to pay for. Mr. Samuels returned home a few days into my newfound alone time, and imagine my absolute surprise when the gentle Mr. Rogers-esque fella that I pictured was absolutely nothing like that at all. Mr. Samuels may have been 75 years old, but he was the kind of 75 that looked ex-Navy SEAL, and in fact was, and who probably had a home gym, and he did, and he was a muscular, confidently spoken, weirdly charming man, and at first I wondered why he needed a regular nurse, and then when I first saw the nurse show up for his first appointment, I remembered that my mother can be rather naive sometimes. Let's just say that she was the kind of nurse who is paid good money to relieve someone's tension via massage, and just leave it at that. But hey, the man was single, and just because he was old, it didn't mean that he didn't have needs. And every other day at 75? Damn, I was almost in awe. Now, he did bake a very good red velvet cake, and one of his first acts as a welcome gift was to bring a cake over and introduce himself. I'll admit, while he was charming, he also made my skin crawl. I'm a 32-year-old woman, and this 75-year-old man, who looked like he could easily overpower me without a moment's thought, was very clearly trying to rizz me up, as the kids say. And I usually hate the phrase undressing me with his eyes, but there was no better way to describe it here. And Mr. Samuels made no secret of it. He'd make remarks like, Gladys never said her daughter was so cute, or how he'd wished that he'd known my mom when she was my age, things like that. It would have been flattering if it wasn't so intense, and he wasn't quite so, I don't know how to describe it, but he had this aura where it was obvious that he wanted me to know that he could take me. And I've known guys like this since high school, but never once was he ever twice my age. And he wasn't so much a silver fox as a white wolf, and once I got that image in my head, I couldn't shake it. Thankfully, I didn't have many dealings with Mr. Samuels outside of him bringing over baked goods, and in the end, as much as it hurts me to have to do so, I ended up tossing them out because I was becoming paranoid that he might be slipping something into the baking. I'd watched an Instagram short about a predator who did some fairly gross stuff like that, and I got it inside my own head about it a little. Looking back, I am pretty grateful that I didn't risk it. And so after a month of catching up on art commissions and emailing editors begging for work, I began to go a little stir-crazy. Surprisingly, Mom didn't call anywhere near as much as I expected, and I found myself missing my goofy parents a lot. We had a few Zoom calls, but the internet on the cruise ship wasn't exactly reliable, and so half of the time it was like watching my folks in stop motion while Mom yelled, "What was that? What did you say, Sel?" over and over, as my name is Celeste, but she calls me Sel. I decided to surprise my parents by giving the house a little bit of a decluttering, or at least the parts that I knew that I was allowed to touch. Aunt Joni's paintings could stay, but I knew that the attic was an absolute crap show of disorganization. Plus, I figured that I'd find a bunch of fun childhood memories up there, and maybe some stuff that was worth a bit of money. I remember my brother having a bunch of old consoles and action figures that surely had to be worth something, and God knows that we both could have used the money since we were both artists. I wasn't in the attic for long before I came to two realizations. One, this was going to be a mammoth job, and two, someone had cut a hole in the drywall between our attic and the adjoining one. And of course, it was Mr. Samuel's attic. Not only that, cables were snaking through the hole, followed them through the maze of boxes and old Christmas decorations, and I was horrified at what I found. Holes had been drilled into the floor, very recently by the look of the sawdust, and two wires snaked down into two rooms. Now, without going into technical details, I traced the wires to the bathroom and the bedroom that I was staying in and discovered that small cameras had been set up, hidden within fake smoke alarms. Now, following the wires back up and creeping into Mr. Samuel's attic, I found a laptop running with active feeds of both rooms. The bedroom camera was angled so you could see the whole room, and the bathroom camera was angled at the shower. And so in short, dear sweet old Mr. Samuels had literally been spying on me for God knows how long and had violated my privacy in the most diabolically disgusting way. I minimized the live feed and found a folder on the desktop marked quote-unquote best of. The contents horrified me. There were a number of videos of me showering, of me changing, and even a couple of where I was, for want of a better term, relieved some tension of being single in bed. Now, without thinking, in utter disgust, I deleted the entire folder and emptied the recycle bin, and then immediately realized the idiotic move I'd made. Subconsciously, though, I think my brain drove me to do so in order to avoid considering law enforcement, and more on that later. I wanted revenge on Samuels, but I also wanted him to live with fear of the revenge. Now, my first step was to sever the wires connecting the cameras. My second step was to head downstairs and reach out to a friend of mine who was, how do I put this, good with computers. He sent me a piece of software to install on Mr. Samuel's computer via a USB stick that would completely mess up not only his laptop, but any computer connected to the same router. Irreparably, my friend promised. Now, I should add here that I knew Samuels was out of town for a few days, supposedly visiting his daughters again. Now, who knows what he really got up to? It could have been literally anything. And he was due back the next day, so I hurried and installed the virus on his laptop via that USB stick. I followed my friend's instructions and then forced myself to leave the attic and wait a day or so for Mr. Samuels to return. And I could tell when he discovered the outcome of his deception. From his laptop speaker, a robotic voice began blaring, "I'm a voyeur pervert and I also have kids," over and over again. Above me, I could hear Samuels freaking out until he slammed that laptop shut. Then I heard his footsteps thundering down the stairs, presumably to his other main PC, and I waited and then, "I'm a voyeur pervert and I also have kids." According to my friend, there was absolutely no way to get rid of this unless you were a tech genius or whatever. Something about writing it to the root of the BIOS or something, so even a hard drive wipe and Windows reinstall wouldn't fix it. And something told me that while Mr. Samuels might be capable of setting up a pervert spy network, he wasn't capable of fixing this. I was right, because the next weekend, I saw his entire desktop PC smashed into little bits sitting out on the sidewalk for the garbage collection. Hilariously, they wouldn't take electronics, so it was just sort of left there until the HOA contacted him about the unsightly garbage, and the next day, a snapped laptop joined the pile. Now, I'm sure he suspected me because the baking delivery stopped, and he also avoided eye contact with me whenever we'd pass each other coming and going. Now, I still felt sick that this dirty, disgusting old perv had gotten away with getting off to me at my most vulnerable, though. I kept consoling myself with the reminder that he was 75 and would be dead long before me. But then I had nightmares about how he might have sent the videos to other like-minded perverts. No matter how much I reminded myself that the low-quality, grainy pictures made my identity impossible to discern, it didn't help because Samuels could easily have doxed me. I live in fear of something else happening, but nothing else did. I confessed my fears to my friend, though, who suggested one final idea. I don't know exactly what he did, but a few days later, a smartphone arrived in the mail. My friend told me to stick it through Samuel's mailbox in the middle of the night and just leave it at that. And I asked him why and what the phone contained, but he told me it was better that I didn't know. I posted the phone. Whatever was on there had caused Samuels to become a recluse, and the rest of my house sitting went without incident. And after a while, I noticed that the nurse was no longer coming to visit Samuels. Good. And that man didn't deserve any joy in his life. And eventually my parents returned from their cruise. I didn't tell them anything about what had happened. I was honestly just too ashamed, and too worried that my dad, the mild-mannered as he was usually, would spend his remaining years in prison for killing their next-door neighbor if he knew what he'd done to his baby girl. Now, a few months after I moved out into my own place again, Mom mentioned that Mr. Samuels had been placed into an assisted living facility by his children. She said it was all very strange, like he mentally declined within the space of a year. Now, I said nothing, but I had to suppress a smile there. I don't know if I did the right thing by not calling the cops and handling everything in this very unusual way, but here's the reason. When I was in college, I was assaulted. My experience with the police was, well, as I'm sure some of you know, not so good. And I was made to feel like it was all my fault because of how I dressed and because I'd had maybe 2 drinks, because I'd been affectionate with my assailant. I know all cops aren't like that. I know that plenty of cops are sympathetic, even heroic with certain victims, but I was not one of them. And the idea of trying to convince them that my elderly neighbor was spying on me, even though realistically the evidence was all there, it just terrified me. And so maybe I handled things pretty badly. Maybe me and my friend taking justice into our own hands was an immoral decision. But honestly, knowing what that man was capable of in his 70s, I can only imagine the things that he may have done when he was younger, fitter, and more savvy at getting away with it. And knowing he's spending the last years of his life slowly losing his mind in an assisted living facility, probably being spoon-fed baby food by a tattooed male orderly who he can't sexually harass, well, honestly, I sleep at night just fine. I do still periodically check for spy cams, though, as I'm quite paranoid and you can never be too careful. Do any of you have someone who you'll never forget, even though you never really knew them that well? Someone who was a constant in your life, just sort of a background character who isn't around anymore. Someone you find your mind drifting back to every now and then because even though you didn't know them that much, you just saw them all the time and they were like an interactive, friendly part of the furniture. Now, I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's like a beloved lazy boy that you get from Goodwill. You don't know its backstory and you never will, and you don't ask about its past and it doesn't ask about yours. Christ, this sounds dehumanizing, but it's how I think about it. It's in a fond, loving way, trust me, and I hope one day I'm someone else's Goodwill lazy boy, someone who touched a person's life just by being there and someone they'll always remember. Now, I remember Mr. Browning. I'll never forget him, and even though the last time I saw him was probably 1985, I think I remember him fondly regardless of how things ended. Now, I sure know that I always thought fondly whenever this guy crossed my mind. Me and the wife often talked about how we should invite him over for dinner. We wondered if he was lonely after his wife had passed a decade or so before, and we wondered if his adult kids called often because they never seemed to visit. But we just never got around to asking Mr. Browning. Hell, I don't even remember what his Christian name was. It was always, "Good morning, Mr. Browning," and he'd respond with, "Good morning, Ted." He was my elder. We understood the hierarchy, and I do know that he was a former teacher, so maybe he thought of himself as Mr. Browning. Maybe it didn't even cross his mind to ask me to call him by his first name. Amos, That was it, Amos Browning, and I remember from his obituary and later the funeral. And I think those were the only times that I heard his first name spoken and one of the only times that I saw his adult children. His son was a very doughy-faced man who looked bored to be at his father's funeral. His daughter was one of those sharp-faced women with a meek, sycophantic husband and the kind of bratty son who wanted to be the center of attention, even at Grandpa's wake. We didn't stay long. We'd gone to pay our tributes to Mr. Browning, but we couldn't stay. We didn't want his family asking us questions about his death, and they likely knew that I'd been present when it happened, and I'm not a good liar. I would have struggled to give them the answers they wanted instead of the horrible, haunting, traumatizing truth. Me and Mr. Browning used to chat over the fence. Well, I'd lean over the fence and he'd mow the lawn, and he was always mowing his lawn. He had one of those old push mowers, an electric one, and I just kept trying to persuade him to buy a ride on, but he said his yard was way too small for that. It wasn't, and besides, at his age, probably early 70s, it was a great way to get some exercise and a little peace and quiet. Peace and quiet from who, I'm not really sure, since he lived alone after his wife had passed before me and my family moved in, but that's what he said. We'd talk, a lot, but never really get to know each other, you know. We talked about the Detroit Lions a bunch. He was a die-hard supporter, and I was just a pretty casual one. And we talked about the weather, we talked about politics, but never too seriously, and sometimes we'd watch the same shows at the same time, and we'd talk about those too. We both loved Miles Davis and The Who and Kiss, and he told me about his first ever concert, sneaking in to watch Kiss play, but I was never sure if he was telling the truth or just recounting the plot of that one movie where that exact thing happens. It was a fun story anyhow, even if he told me about 5 times, and occasionally he'd ask about my wife and how she was doing and how her job was going, but I think he wanted to talk about his wife in exchange but couldn't bring himself to do so, apart from that one time. Sometimes my wife would bring him a lasagna or some other baked goods, and he'd thank her like a perfect gentleman. And he always handed the dishes back to me over the fence, never once brought them to our door, always over the fence. Now, I chatted to him so much that by the time we moved out, there was a groove in the ground where grass had stopped growing in the place where I'd always stood to talk to Mr. Browning. Now, I remember exactly what we were talking about on the day it happened. My wife had just had a minor operation to remove a benign cyst from her breast, and he was asking how she was doing. I told him she was doing fine and would be home from the hospital the next day or even that evening if things went well. Mr. Browning looked at me then as he was mowing the lawn and then told me that I was lucky and I should hold on to a good woman like that. And then he said, and I'll never forget it, not least because they were his last words, he said, "I miss her so much." And then he sort of looked down, away, like he was about to hide tears, but I saw a look of alarm and then fear across his face. Maybe I'm just imagining, but I swear that I saw him try and stop the forward motion of the mower as he pushed forward. I'm not sure how it happened. He was always so careful, running the electrical extension cable around the edge of the lawn, making sure that he was mowing nowhere near it, being careful like it was muscle memory. But I heard the crunch and whir of the motor running over the electrical socket and the cable. I don't know how or why, but there was no grounding. The mower's rubber handles just sort of weren't there anymore, and the live electrical cables got tangled into the motor blades, mangling and electrifying the mower as Mr. Browning held onto it. And hold onto it he did. I watched in abject frozen horror as his body began to convulse, as smoke rose up from his hands where he was gripping the metal handle. I could smell the cooking flesh and electrical burn. I watched as the grass around him singed and blackened, and I knew I had to knock him away from the mower but couldn't touch him myself. I searched for something, anything that I could safely use to shove him off the mower. My eyes settled on my old wooden baseball bat, but by the time I'd hauled myself over that fence, I knew it was too late. Mr. Browning had collapsed to the ground, finally letting go of the lawnmower, and I knew that there was no saving him, so I ran over to the outlet and switched off the electricity. Then I went back over to my neighbor, my friend who I knew so little about, and he was blackened and charred. His face was horrific. His eyeballs had somehow survived the electrocution, and they stared white and frozen out of a face that looked like it had been sucked clean from the inside. One detail I remember, one grim detail is how his mouth was open and how I realized that he had false teeth because they had fallen down into his throat. I ran into his house and called 911, and the rest was a blur of paramedics and police and being questioned. And at first, when his daughter got there, she seemed to somehow blame me for her father's death, as if she'd ever given a crap about him in life. He may not have opened up to me, but Mr. Browning certainly made it clear that his kids did not play a big part in his life. And so fast forward to the funeral, the son gave a eulogy, and it was like he barely knew his father any better than I did. It made me so sad and devastated that this man who seemed like nothing but a nice, amicable gentleman could have been so forgotten and discarded, except for the neighbor who gave him some friendly, superficial banter over the fence, the same neighbor who was forced to watch him die. I swore then that when I had a kid, I would do everything I could to make sure that they wanted me in their life forever. And as it turned out, my wife was unknowingly pregnant at the time of that funeral. We had a son and then later 2 daughters, and they were the loves of my life. They're all grown themselves now with families of their own, and my wife and I are grandparents, and we make sure to keep our family close, regular meals together, Christmas and Thanksgiving being particularly huge affairs. Now, maybe Mr. Browning hadn't been a great father. It's not for me to judge his kids for distancing themselves from him. I don't judge them for their relationship with their father. It just sort of makes me sad. But before the sadness came the trauma. We bought our home with the intention of starting a family there, but every time I so much as stepped foot in the backyard, I was met with flashbacks of Mr. Browning cooking alive. I could smell that electric burn and see those bulging, dead eyes. We made a loss selling, but we moved, and my son was born in a smaller house, but it was one filled with love and closeness, and I was no longer haunted by the sight of my neighbor's final moments, at least not directly. Like I said, I'll always remember Mr. Browning, and part of that means being cursed with remembering how I played witness to his demise. Evening, let's read. I'm a normal, regular-ass guy with a wife and kid. I lead a quiet life, I work in a bank, and I'm the last person to get involved in drama or scary situations or anything that you might want to hear about on your channel. At least, that's how I've always wanted to live my life anyway. Sometimes you don't have a choice, and that lack of choice doesn't come from your own actions, but from those around you. In my case, it was a house. And even before all of this happened, we used to call it the Nightmare House. We, being me and the other neighbors, who were mostly friends, we do safari suppers, quiz nights at the local bar, all sorts of stuff like that. And apart from a handful of residents who had good reason, everyone got involved, and it was a nice, friendly community. And then there was the house next door to mine. The owner never joined us for events or hung out, and he never attended street parties or barbecues or singing carols during Christmas. Not because he was antisocial, but because we never once even met him. He'd never lived in the house, not since any of us could remember. Old Mr. Peterson said he could vaguely remember the owner from when he'd first bought the property a few decades back, but since then, nothing. And for whatever reason, this guy had bought the house and then just screwed off to South Africa or some such place and just left the property to gradually fall into ruin. And there must have been a caretaker at some point because ever since any of us could remember, all the windows were boarded up and the doors were sealed with planks, but beyond that, it was clear that nobody cared for the property. The yards front and back were both overgrown and almost jungle-like, and the neighbors sometimes considered trying to maintain the outside a little, but good God. We all had our own lives and properties, and it wasn't like we were some uptight homeowners association. It was just kind of annoying to have this eyesore right in the middle of our normal suburban neighborhood. We kind of joked around about the owner, like he was a vampire who lived in the basement and the abandonment was some ruse or gallows humor and he died years ago and nobody noticed. And this joke kind of weighed on us, and one of the neighbors contacted the district for, I don't know, some kind of international wellness check. Now, we were assured that the owner was perfectly fine and living abroad and had every right to leave his property the way it was, as long as it wasn't in danger of collapsing or causing a safety hazard. And then the graffiti started, and we knew that it was a few of the neighborhood kids letting off some steam, including, I suspected, my own 15-year-old son, and so none of us really did anything about it. But slowly and surely, the building started to get tagged, scribbled at first, and then some genuinely kind of impressive artwork. And it was better than the squat brick monstrosity with the boarded-up windows, I guess. One piece was a parody of that British artist Banksy, and I am absolutely certain that one was my son because he'd conveniently been asking me about Banksy a few weeks before the art appeared. And so yeah, we called it the Nightmare House, but it was all in good fun, and if the owner cared about the graffiti or the yard turning into the Amazon, then he certainly never let that on. And for all I know, there was nobody in the vicinity who was even in touch with him, and he simply didn't know or care. Why he bought the house and left it to rot was anyone's guess. I know the answer now, but that can wait until the end of the story. We first noticed that something was up with the Nightmare House when one day, the boards over the front door disappeared. That was all, nothing more, just that. Murmurs spread through the neighborhood. Had the owner finally returned after his decades-long estrangement from his poop hole of a house? Had he employed a caretaker? Had he sold the property? Sadly, none of the answers were this positive, as we'd soon learn. Squatters had moved in. And looking back, it's wild that this hadn't happened before now. The place was rife for squatting, and yet it had remained untouched. Not anymore, though. A few of us kept watch. Yeah, I know this makes us sound like curtain-twitching Karens, but some of us had young kids and we wanted to know what kind of squatters we were dealing with here. And we counted 4 regulars who clearly lived there and a bunch of others who came and went. And it was pretty obvious from the get-go that these weren't student squatters or struggling homeless people who just wanted a warm place for the night. One of the guys, the leader I would call them, was bald and covered in tattoos. He had about 5 visible teeth, and when he was shirtless, which was often, you could see vicious purple track marks running up and down his forearms. And he wasn't the kind of addict that you could feel sorry for, though. This guy was nasty. If he saw one of us even glancing in his direction, he'd hiss and let loose a torrent of abuse. He really wanted to establish the fact that this was his neighborhood now, and none of us better F with him. The other squatters called him Crunk. What a name, though. And then there was Blippo and F-Jockey. Not exactly how that name went. Then there was Blippo and F-Jockey. Not exactly sure how that name went. And they were almost as bad as him. F-Jockey was missing a leg just below the knee, and sometimes he'd hobble around on a rusty prosthetic, and other times he'd traverse the broken pathways of the Nightmare House in a cranky old wheelchair, and I'm amazed that thing even really moved. And finally there was Finlay, who was the least worst of the 4. He'd at least occasionally offer mumbled apologies to the neighbors, while sort of skulking around wearing the same gray hoodie that he always wore. And he also clearly never washed it because you could smell him coming a mile off or smell where he'd been. And this is why I say that he was the least worst rather than a good guy, because when the thefts started, the crime scenes often reeked of Finlay, and he was the smallest and thinnest of the squatters, and we were certain that he was the one sneaking into neighbors' houses and stealing food and essentials. Never anything valuable, nothing that could cause too much of a rage, but someone was stealing our bread and our Twinkies, our detergent, that kind of stuff. And of course he somehow managed to slip in and out unnoticed without violently breaking and entering, and so whenever we reported these thefts to the cops, it sounded kind of pathetic. "Oh hey, officer, yeah, someone stole a bunch of bananas from the counter," or "Excuse me, detective, but our mop's gone missing and I can smell the aftermath of some homeless man." What we did try doing was reporting the squatters to the authorities, but apparently there are laws and protections for squatters, particularly ones that require the property's owner to make the report themselves. The cops told us that the owner wouldn't even respond to them about it, and he was almost impossible to track down in whichever foreign country he lived in anyway, so for all they could prove, the squatters were legitimate tenants. They weren't, of course, you could just tell, but without the owner actually confirming this or filing any kind of charges, they were free to come and go in their adopted home as they pleased. And they would do all sorts of stupid and creepy crap that gradually wore us down. My family, me, my wife, and my 2 kids were their direct neighbors, so we got the brunt of the hassle. And it started with dumb stuff, like connecting my garden hose to an outdoor faucet, and then swiping the hose and using it to fill their outdoor pool. And this was during a time when using hoses was banned, so I only found out about this when I received a letter warning me about my property's water usage. And even though I couldn't prove for sure that it was the squatters, but the hose had been left right by the fence, and they mysteriously had a full pool in their back garden. Not an actual one or anything, it was like a large kiddie pool, but still. Now, one time I did catch them. They'd connected an extension cord to our outdoor electricity outlet and snaked it over the fence to plug in what appeared to be an in-progress stereo stack system like you'd find in the 80s. And it seemed like they were building some kind of outdoor sound system under a makeshift gazebo they'd erected. And in retrospect, I should have been more alarmed by what this implied, but I was too mad about the electrical theft. I just unplugged the extension cord, and despite my wife pleading for me to just let it go, I stormed next door. F-Jockey answered the door, laying it on heavy about how hard it had been for him to answer the door trying to play the victim, but I was having none of it. I demanded to speak to Crunk. F-Jockey told me to wait and then shut the door in my face. Now I could hear him yelling for Crunk inside and then heard Crunk's response, and he sounded pretty heavily high on whatever. And when he eventually came to the door, his eyes were bloodshot and he still had a rubber strap tied around his upper arm. To his credit, it was the first time that he'd ever been polite and amicable. He apologized, very sincerely, for stealing my electricity, but told me that he thought that I wouldn't mind because I seemed like such a nice, generous guy who clearly cared for his neighbors. And then he started going on about how we were all children of Gaia and how electricity was a tool of the man, and if we didn't share it and spread it around, then we were just doing what they wanted. It was nonsense, but the way he spoke and the cadence of his voice, there was something hypnotic about it. I somehow found myself agreeing to let him use my outdoor outlet, and as I walked away, I kind of realized how Charles Manson managed to get so many followers. Some people just have something about them, no matter how obnoxious and vile they seem to be, and Crunk was clearly one of these people. The more I thought about it, the more dangerous I realized he could potentially be. I knew that we either had to drive those squatters out or somehow integrate them into the community. At our next hangout with the neighborhood guys, we decided that we'd try the latter. We'd invite them to our next cookout and try and make them feel welcome. Maybe they could help. And I was the one hosting the neighborhood cookout, so they could just hop the fence and join us for burgers and beers. I didn't have the opportunity to invite them to the cookout, though, as the next day, I went to get the barbecue grill set up for the summer and give it the usual routine maintenance and a good clean. And to my surprise, the space it usually occupied on my back porch was just empty. It wasn't a tiny barbecue grill either. It was a good 4 feet wide, a decently expensive piece of kit. How they got it over the fence and into the Nightmare House's yard is beyond me even now. But steal it they did, which I confirmed by glancing over the fence and saw Crunk and the boys grilling burgers on my grill, which they hadn't cleaned, so it was giving off a bit of a stench. When Crunk saw me looking, he waved and gave me a whole, "Hey neighbor, want to come over for some patties?" Now I kind of just let out that it was my grill, and Crunk sort of beamed this wide, toothless smile and said, yeah, he knew. He thought he'd give it a trial run for me before barbecue season started actually. And that was, of course, that they'd clean it all up and return it unharmed when they were done with it. I just felt helpless. What the hell was I supposed to say? I felt positioned on a knife's edge, like everything was just about balanced right now, but a single nudge in my entire life would collapse straight into the blade. I don't know if I'm expressing just how intimidating it all was, but ever since they moved in, it was just these looks, these sneers, these snatches of overheard conversation that I couldn't prove were about me and the neighbors, but were definitely talking about how they'd mess things up for anyone who gave them a hassle. And Crunk had these eyes that had a sort of dead glint to them. Crazy eyes, just like Manson or any of those cult leader guys. Now maybe I'm just a pussy, but I genuinely felt like if I dared to fight back in any way, something terrible would befall me and my family. My cowardice changed that weekend, though. I'd been working late into the night, so I didn't get up until just past midday, and my wife was out at her job. My son was camping with some buddies, so I called for my daughter to say hi, but she was nowhere to be found. I brewed my morning, now afternoon, coffee and stepped into the yard for a little cigarette. I know, smoking will kill you. Don't start it, kids. Anyways, I could smell cooking meat and the pungent smell of my uncleaned grill, and I could hear music playing on the stereo system that the squatters had set up using my electricity. And I could hear voices. Crunk, F-Jockey, Blippo, Finlay, A couple of unfamiliar male voices, a few female voices, and then a very familiar voice sounding kind of unsure and nervous. It was my daughter. My now 16-year-old daughter somehow next door with these filthy squatters. And feeling like a kind of weirdo but not wanting to look like one, I looked over the fence. And there she was, in that weird kiddie pool that they'd filled using my hose. She was wearing a bikini, one that I'd had no idea she even owned, because if I had, I would have had severe words for her about wearing it out, considering it barely covered anything and she was 16 for Christ's sakes. And there she was, in that pool with Crunk, who I could unfortunately see was completely naked, sidling up to my daughter and trying to persuade her to free herself and lose those clothes like the rest of them. And that's when I noticed the other 3 naked girls lounging around that yard. They looked older than my daughter, but only just, and there were a couple of guys, an F-Jockey and Blippo, all completely nude, sprawled out around the garden, eating these greasy burgers and smoking what I definitely could smell was pot. And how the hell they talked my daughter into going over there in just that scrap of a bikini, I'll never know. Following the event, she didn't want to talk about it, and I could tell that she was ashamed and scared, so I never really pushed her on it. All I know is that she implied that Crunk was incredibly persuasive, in exactly the way that I'd considered when I compared him to Charles Manson. A red mist overtook me. I grabbed the first weapon I had, a shovel, and managed to pull myself over the 6-foot-high fence and leap into the squatter's garden. With a blow that impressed even myself, I punctured that kiddie pool with the shovel and then pressed it up against Crunk's throat before anyone had a chance to react. I saw Blippo, the biggest of the guys, start to stand up, and I told him that if he moved a muscle, his buddy would be missing a head. And all the while, I noticed Finlay standing in the corner of the yard kind of shaking, looking like he was going through H withdrawals. Jesus Christ, what a life these people led. And Crunk raised his hands and started on about how I was freaking out over nothing, that I was being a controlling father, that my daughter was an adult in her own person and could do what she wanted. Now, at this point, I was shaking with rage and struggling not to deprive my kids of a father by committing first-degree murder. I told Crunk through these gritted teeth that my daughter was in fact not an adult and was a 16-year-old child. Meanwhile, my daughter was crying and begging me to forgive her, saying that she was sorry, begging me not to think less of her, things like that. It broke my heart, and I told her that I didn't judge her at all, but I couldn't look at her in the moment. Not that I wouldn't, but I was just too hesitant to take my eyes off of Crunk. I told my daughter to get out of the now deflated kiddie pool, grab a towel, and head back to our house now. Crunk had the absolute gall to moan that it was his towel and we couldn't steal it, and I responded by pressing the shovel, brand new and unblunted by lack of use, right against his stupid throat. And I think he knew I was serious. And then when I was sure that my daughter had left the backyard, I said, "I'm gonna go now." And I slowly backed away. As I was leaving, I left them with one final warning. I suggested that they find a new place to squat because my patience was at an end and I wouldn't be so forgiving next time. I said a bunch of other stuff too, like if they ever came near my daughter again it would be the end of them, and that they were no longer going to steal my crap, that kind of thing. And I swear to God, Crunk just smiled at me and said, "May the Lord bless and watch over you." And I remember shivering as I left their back gate and followed my daughter back to our house. For some reason, I didn't think that the Lord which Crunk referred to was the same Lord I worshipped in church most Sundays. And the squatters didn't move out. We had a neighborhood meeting in which we discussed potential ideas of getting rid of them. None of them were any good. They either involved violence or had no chance of working, and we all left feeling very dejected. But then a mysterious stranger solved the problem for us. One evening, all the squatters were out doing God knows what people like that do, and, at least from what I overheard them suspecting, a drug dealer they'd pissed off sent his goons around and firebombed that house with a couple of Molotov cocktails, or something. And the goons somehow got in through the backyard, hurled those cocktails through the back windows, which the squatters had removed the boards from sometime previously. By the time the fire department put the blaze out, the house was a charred husk. Nobody would be living there anytime soon, and no security camera captured footage of the culprits. No arrests were made, and no evidence was found. The squatters moved on, and the neighbors all celebrated their departure despite the scare of the fire. I celebrated too, but it was something that I kept to myself. I'd installed an outdoor security camera after the incident with my daughter, and it captured the neighboring property's yard, and I'd told the cops that I hadn't gotten around to setting it up yet, but that was a lie. You see, the camera didn't capture a bunch of drug dealer henchmen showing up to burn the place down. It captured a single figure, leaving my house in his beloved Nirvana hoodie, and it showed him vaulting over the fence, and with shaking hands, throwing that Molotov into the property, and then it showed him climbing back over the fence and disappearing back into my house. My son and daughter are twins, and my son is incredibly protective over his sister, and we never spoke about the incident. After I viewed and deleted that footage, I spoke to my wife in front of my son and said that they are very lucky that the fire hadn't spread to our house, that the firebombers needed to be more responsible. Responsible, my wife asked and laughed. I just nodded and gave my son a look. One day, I'm going to have to talk with him. I'm going to have to tell him that he must never ever do anything as insane as that again, that violence isn't the answer, that no matter how sure he was that the squatters were all out, he couldn't be 100% sure. But not just yet. For now, I'm just still celebrating their departure and the return of the owner who, due to the structural damage, was able to have the property demolished. Now, for one final sting in the tail, the owner of the property joined us in the bar one night, and he apologized profusely for how things had played out. He explained that he grew up in that house as a foster child, and while he didn't go into detail, he told us that he suffered there, and he called it the Nightmare House, which caused us all to shoot each other a look. He explained that he'd grown up and put the past behind him and become a successful software engineer back when the internet was first taking off. And then, when he saw the house was up for sale in the market, he bought it with the intention of having it demolished then. But he was denied permission by the district for some reason or another, and instead he was left owning the property filled with this cancerous memory like an albatross around his neck. And so his way of getting revenge on the house was to let it rot, and again he apologized profusely for not considering the effect that would have on the rest of the neighborhood. But now, with the damage to the house, he'd finally been granted permission to have it knocked down and had decided that he was going to turn the land into a graffiti art area and a skate park, having seen photos of some of the graffiti before the squatters moved in. He ended the night by saying that he wished he could thank the arsonists and then looked around at all of us. Now, I'm sure he thought one of us had burned the place down, and honestly, even knowing a hint of the dark memories that place held for him, I'm not surprised that he was grateful that he could finally wake up from the nightmares of the Nightmare House. As for what became of those squatters, who knows? And frankly, after the crap they pulled, who cares? So recently, I moved into an apartment block in a pretty artsy area of a pretty artsy neighborhood. Now, I won't dox myself, but you can probably guess one of two places I mean, and it's not the New York one. I love this apartment building. It was more of a boarding house, really. Only 8 apartments and the top floor belonging to the building super. And all the neighbors were really friendly, and most of us were artists of some sort. And there was me, a painter, and then we had a singer, a couple of writers, 2 more painters, and a mixed media artist, and apparently a sculptor. The sculptor was the neighbor directly across from me. Nobody knew his name, or even if he definitely was a he. He just went by the moniker TTT, all capital. The rest of us would often have sort of group brainstorm evenings where we'd chat about art and set the world to rights, in the common room or TV room that we all shared on the ground floor. Triple T never joined us, of course, and soon the mysterious sculptor became the subject of fascination for a group of creatives with hefty imaginations and too much time on our hands, obviously. Nearly all of the theories about TTT's true identity were ridiculous. Most of them were supernatural, and one of the painters absolutely swore that Triple T was Shia LaBeouf and claimed that she'd seen him when he moved in. And when we showed her a photo of Shia LaBeouf, though, she said it was the other Shia LaBeouf, and we could never quite work out what she actually meant by that. One of the writers decided that Triple T was a ghost, like in the movie Ghost, and that his sculptures were all clay pots, and he was waiting for his Demi Moore to sit at the pottery wheel so he could finally create again. The singer claimed that Triple T was a beautiful woman whose face had been disfigured in a terrible car accident, which explained why some of her sculptures displayed in local galleries showed various figures in states of damage. Me, I just thought that Triple T was a reclusive sculptor who valued their privacy. and whenever TTT had a new sculpture to display, it would be found standing outside their apartment, and men in some suits from a certain gallery would come to collect it. Triple T always displayed at the same gallery, which I can't name for the same reason as not wanting to reveal myself. I did try knocking on Triple T's door a few times. Once or twice, I heard signs of life, and one time I was absolutely certain that I was being watched through a peephole. And just a gut feeling, but it did make me shiver. But if Triple T wasn't answering, I wasn't going to keep prying in there. And that's why it shocked me when, one Friday evening, I stepped out of my apartment ready to attend one of our weekly brainstorming sessions, only to see T's apartment door open a crack. Only darkness spilled from within, and I didn't want to enter without permission, so I just said, "Hello?" through the gap. No answer, although I was sure that I heard movement inside. The door was open. Someone could be in trouble, I thought. That was just sort of a justification enough to take a peek inside, right? And I turned on the flashlight app on my phone, but covered it with my palm just in case. And when I stepped inside, it was completely pitch black in there. I raised my phone, warning whoever was in there that I was about to light up the room, and then I slowly moved my hand away from the lens. I was not prepared for what I saw. The room was entirely bare. The walls and floor were sealed in plastic wrap. You know, the kind that they use in Dexter or some serial killer movies when they're about to kill someone in a room and don't want to leave blood splatter. And that wasn't the creepy part, though. The real creepy part was the statue that stood in the center of the room. It wasn't some kind of horror mannequin. It wasn't some horrific effigy of myself or anything else in the building. It was a classic-looking statue of the Holy Mother Mary, the kind that you find in a Catholic church. The only strange thing about her was that instead of a normal face, she'd been painted up to look like, of all things, a mime. I can't explain it, but I was absolutely certain that the statue was watching me. I was certain somehow that Triple T was the statue. The statue was Triple T. I took a tentative step forward and tapped the Mary statue. It was porcelain, and against my better judgment, I started to reach up and touch the face. It looked like flesh, and it looked so much like human flesh. My fingertips were less than an inch away, and I was about to touch it. I was about to touch TTT. And then I heard a noise in the room behind me. It was sort of like a muffled cry, like the word help. And I snatched my hand back from that statue and hurried to the door directly behind the statue. And it was the only door in the room. And before trying to open it, I called out hello again. No response. I grabbed the door handle and twisted it. The door was locked, but the moment I twisted the door open, I heard a loud, shattering crash behind me. Quickly whipping around, I saw the Mother Mary statue shattering and collapsing to the floor. I had no idea what to do. Had I just destroyed some priceless artifact? I walked up to that debris as carefully as I could, and the face was just laying there, and I'd been right. It was skin, sort of. It was a latex ball with Mary's face painted on it, and then a voice spoke from an unseen speaker somewhere in the room. "I am TTT. This is art. You are the art. Please leave." And so I left. I left and ran down the stairs and cursed myself a million times for not filming what I'd just seen. I told everyone what had happened, and we all rushed upstairs, but TTT's door was once again locked. And once again, I was certain that as we all stood there, someone was watching us through that peephole. And 2 days later, there was a small portable safe left outside of TTT's apartment, and the same guys in suits came to collect it. 2 days later after that, I received a gilded invitation in the mail to attend a private showing at Gallery Redacted before it opened to the public, and the invite was from Triple T themselves. Of course, I went, hoping to meet the reclusive sculptor. No such luck. Triple T's agent was there and informed me that Triple T's final piece was being unveiled that night. Unlike all their other pieces, it was a video. It was a video showing me entering the apartment, a black bar across my face to protect my identity. It showed me from various camera angles, cameras that must have been hidden in the walls, in the ceiling, and then it showed me from the perspective of Mother Mary's eyes. And for a second, just a few frames, the sensor bar disappeared and my face was replaced by that of a skull. And then it showed me rushing for the door, and here, The camera split into two joint shots, one showing me turning the doorknob, the other showed the statue trembling and collapsing, clearly triggered by some kind of mechanism in the door. Then the rest mostly played out how I described it. Except as I picked up Mother Mary's head, again the sensor bar disappeared from my face and this time briefly showed an angel, like a Greek sculpture. And the final shot of the video was simply text saying, "Life is clay, and you are all my sculpture. Goodbye, TTT." That was the only time the video was shown. I've tried to track down a copy for this last year. If anyone out there has any leads at all, please let me know in the comments. But holy crap, this was the creepiest and most bizarre thing to happen to me, and I am obsessed with getting a copy of this video. If anyone has any leads, anyone at all, please comment. I need to see it again. I need to understand why Triple T was trying to say this and what it says about me. All the other artists in the boarding houses have theories, and I'll leave you to make up your own. But there's one thing I've learned from all of this, one universal truth that speaks to us all in our very soul. Artists are freaking weird, man. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations. Look at it anywhere you listen to podcasts. And I also have a true crime channel called Saturn's Soul. All links in the description below. So, thanks so much, friends. And remember to ride your mountain bike with the seat off. Grief can do some strange things to people. That's what I was always told anyway. My mom first told me that when one of my high school friends lost her sister and started dressing up and acting like her sister. It made sense to me then, and I went out of my way to befriend her. Now, we're still close BFFs to this day, incidentally, and that's relevant to the story because she's a bit of a Let's Read fangirl, and she's the one who encouraged me to write in with this tale. Now don't worry, she won't mind that I've included the personal little bit about her. She's proofreading and approving the whole thing, by the way. Now this incident happened when I was 19. I've taken a year out after high school before going to college so I could work and put together some savings to avoid my student loans from being sky high. It didn't really work, but at least I tried. Now this was back in I think maybe 2012 when Facebook was still really popular. We had a local neighborhood watch. I wasn't really a member as such. I didn't go to meetings or get involved, but I was their honorary mascot, which meant that I was a member of the Facebook group. Now one day, I logged on to find the group totally abuzz. A whole bunch of the neighbors had witnessed something straight out of a horror movie, apparently. As the previous night, an elderly woman had been walking up and down the street, pushing an industrial-style shopping cart. No harm done, right? Well, the shopping cart contained a full-sized coffin. And she wasn't just walking down the street once. She was walking down the street, disappearing for a while, and then walking back the way she came. One of the neighbors, a night owl guy that I knew, his name was James, decided to follow her at a distance. He discovered that she had been walking in a circle around a few blocks and then turning around at a certain point and repeating the circuit in reverse. Everyone's posts were rife with speculation. Why was she carting a coffin around? Was that even legal? Apparently it looked like a fairly battered, dirty coffin, and some of the theories were wild. Now it took me, a 19-year-old girl, to provide a grounded suggestion. It was a Halloween prop. It was the start of October, so it wasn't out of the ordinary. Now James immediately shot my idea down. I hadn't seen her, Why would this extremely elderly lady be walking a circuit around the block with a spirit Halloween coffin in a shopping cart? That's a good point, James, but had he considered dementia? Maybe the old lady lived on the next street over and she was suffering from sundown syndrome, which causes dementia sufferers to start acting weird right after nightfall. It was as good an explanation as any. But whatever. It had happened, it was over, and I guess we'd never know, I said. But wrong. I was very wrong. And the next night, the old woman was back, walking her little loops, and this time, James called me up. Now, I'm sure he'd been waiting for an excuse to call me. The guy actually did have a crush on me since middle school, and he told me to look out my window. Now, sure enough, the old woman was there, and she was really, really old. I was amazed that she had the strength to push a shopping cart around at all, let alone one with a coffin in it. And she wasn't pushing it slowly either. She was striding around like a woman half her age. Now, one thing I noticed that nobody else had seemed to pick up on was that this coffin really did not look like some spirit Halloween prop. If so, it was the most realistic prop I'd ever seen, and it looked a lot more like a film or TV prop than anything else. At least it couldn't be a real coffin, could it? Now, this whole fiasco went on for another few days. I was on vacation from work, so I was happy to play night owl for a while, and then, that Sunday night, the elderly woman didn't show up. I breathed a sigh of relief, and perhaps this was the end of it. No. The next day, Monday, she was back, and I couldn't help but notice that the coffin was starting to look a little worse for the wear. It had been raining almost constantly for a week, mostly some light rain but heavier in the daytime, and I wondered if she'd been storing the coffin outside because it certainly looked like the wood was starting to get mold and splinter a little bit. Tuesday came and went, and I saw her again. Now the old woman was starting to fall apart. I really started to pay attention to her appearance. She looked almost confused and scared. Her gait, which had been strong to start with, was really starting to falter, and I was beginning to be more and more convinced that this was dementia. Now, the rest of the neighborhood watch seemed hesitant to get involved, even James. I think he even spooked them out a little. When I kept insisting that we should do something, the adults kept telling me to leave it. She wasn't doing any harm, and there must be a good explanation for it. Now, a far cry from the first night, which had set the whole of the neighborhood watch abuzz. On Wednesday, the woman was really struggling. I'd become used to her role by now, and by my reckoning, it was taking her about twice as long to do her route. Now on Thursday, she was struggling even further because one of the wheels on her shopping cart had gone all gimpy, and she really had to struggle to keep it straight. On Friday night, I decided I was going to go outside and actually approach her. Now, my parents were away for the weekend. I didn't tell anyone about what I was going to do, as she was an elderly woman who must have been in at least her mid-80s. What was the worst she could do? And so I left my house shortly before I knew that she'd show up and pretended I was outside having a smoke, and I bumped into her by complete accident. It was very clear to me that she was confused. She kept calling me Gloria, which isn't even slightly my name, but eventually I managed to persuade her to open up, and the story she told me was heartbreaking and tragic. The old woman used to live somewhere around here with her husband many years ago. He passed sometime in the 80s, and they'd frequently gone for evening walks around the block, and she had it in her mind that if she started taking those long walks again, she might be able to reconnect with him. At first, her story brought me to tears. The whole thing was so tragic, and she reminded me much of my great-grandma, who had succumbed to Alzheimer's when I was younger, and I wanted to hug the old woman, who told me her name was Ethel, but it felt like it'd be intrusive. Now, I was so focused on the story that she told me that I almost forgot about the coffin itself, and suddenly it struck me. She was walking the neighborhood to reconnect with her husband, but she was carting this coffin around. It couldn't be, could it? I allowed myself to actually look at the coffin. Now, I'd been avoiding looking the whole time, as I suspected that the wood had started rotting in places, and there were a couple of holes in the coffin lid that had led me into the interior. Thankfully, I couldn't see much, but I could see enough. There definitely was some type of bones in that coffin. My hands started shaking, and I told Ethel to wait where she was because I wanted to help her, and then I stepped away a little, called 911 and whispered to the dispatch about what was happening. I told them that if they send the cops, please don't send them with sirens because she's a very old, vulnerable woman and I didn't want to give her a heart attack or anything. However, it wasn't Ethel who risked having a heart attack. When I turned back to comfort her, I was absolutely horrified to see that she had opened the coffin. Years in the ground had not done her husband justice. It was mostly bones with patches of shriveled skin in places. His clothes had all rotted off, and one thing that stuck with me was that his scalp was partially intact and strands of hair hung down one side of his skeletal face. I almost screamed then and ran, but I didn't want to startle Ethel. She seemed so proud to be showing off her husband, as if opening the coffin to show me had suddenly reunited her with her beloved. It's very strange, this feeling of terror and revulsion and grief and sympathy all at once, but I can safely say that I've experienced that combination. I talked to Ethel for a few minutes, trying to keep my eyes off the corpse next to us, which holy hell did it reek. When the cops pulled in, without the sirens on as I requested, and I was unbelievably relieved. Everything was quiet, controlled chaos after that. They took poor Ethel away in a police car and she stayed fully silent. They called a coroner to come for the coffin and the body, and meanwhile, it all suddenly hit me and I started shivering and convulsing in shock, so I was actually carted off to a hospital eventually. It turned out that Ethel's husband's coffin had been stolen 5 years ago. Ethel was 93 at the time that I met her. It was very clear to all of us that an 88-year-old woman was not capable of exhuming a coffin and transporting it out of a graveyard. Whoever helped her has, as far as I'm aware, still never been identified. Ethel fell into a catatonic state immediately following the events. She spent some months in a nursing home, during which I visited her at least twice a week. Now, eventually pneumonia took her, and I hope she's finally reunited with her husband, who I found out was named Clive. Thankfully, I was able to find some photos of him with Ethel in her room that her granddaughter had brought for her, and it was much better a way to picture Clive than the rotting, decomposing corpse he'd been when we first met. Now, I don't think I'll ever get that sight out of my head. It was horrific, tragic, and a terrifying series of events. But it did make for one heck of a story for the Neighborhood Watch Facebook group. Do you like fire, Joel? I used to. I used to enjoy bonfires and campfires. I used to love staring into the flames and imagining I could see all kinds of magical things in them. Now, fire just fills me with fear. Not just because of one event, but because of two. They occurred a few months apart, but they are almost certainly linked. The first event happened when I was walking home from town one day. I live within walking distance of the shopping district. Yay for the UK and its tiny landmass, so walking into town was a weekly trip for me. I live in a no-through terrace street with footpaths on one end. One leads from the town/train station, and the other leads to the suburbs and further out of town. I was walking down the footpath leading to my street when I noticed a group of 3 very drunk, very loud people just ahead of me. 2 men and a woman. I could hear them over the sounds of Rammstein playing through my headphones, but I shut off my iPhone so I could hear them clearer. They were some of the most vulgar, unpleasant people I have ever had the misfortune to follow, and I prayed that they didn't stop, turn around, and see me. They were clearly 50,000 sheets to the wind, and from the sounds of their jabbering, they were looking for a fight with someone. Anyone, probably. Thankfully, they were too focused on heading to wherever to stop and turn around. As I reached the turning into my street, they crossed over to the next footpath. I watched with disgust as one of them tossed a cigarette butt into the hedge of my neighbor at the end of the street. As soon as I got home and unpacked my shopping, I headed upstairs and checked out the window. I was a little concerned about the discarded cigarette butt because it was a dry summer and the hedge had started turning brown and dry. And before I even had a chance to scope out the end of the street, I knew something was up. It looked like it was snowing, in August, and I quickly realized that ash was blowing past my window. I quickly looked out to the right and saw that flames were licking up my neighbor's hedge. I grabbed my phone and called a couple of neighbors, ones that I knew were members of the neighborhood watch, and then I immediately ran outside. Before I even had a chance to get halfway down the street, the entire hedge, and I'm talking an extremely large, deciduous hedge here, had caught fully ablaze. Other neighbors started emerging from their houses, and we felt helpless as we realized that there was pretty much no way to get any kind of water towards the hedge. A bunch of us had called the fire brigade, but we had to watch in horror as the fire spread across the garden and caused the large tree in the center of my neighbor's front garden to suddenly erupt into flames. Now, it seemed like it took mere seconds for the tree to turn into a smoldering, blackened trunk and dead branches. Thankfully, that killed this part of the fire, but there was still the hedge to contend with, and with the danger of the fire spreading to the house. Thankfully, the fire brigade got there and managed to control the blaze. Once things had calmed down, I drew one of the firemen aside and told him about the trio that I'd seen tossing a potentially lit cigarette butt into the hedge, as it was clear that this had caused the fire. Now, to my surprise, the fireman seemed completely disinterested. In fact, he acted like I was an annoyance or like he didn't believe me. And this really infuriated me because I guess I was a younger person at the time, and obviously young people, and when I say young, I mean mid-20s, apparently can't be taken seriously. And this event is what caused me to finally, properly join the neighborhood watch. I did pretty well in my first few months as a fully fledged member. I recruited other neighbors and persuaded them to join. As someone who often works nights, I kept an eye out and was able to scare off at least one or two potential vehicle vandals. I saw a guy dealing weed on the corner a few times, but I'm not that much of a narc, so I let that one be. And then, one night, I was up very late playing video games on the computer in my room at the back of the house. Now, I forget what I was playing, but it must have been something quiet because, despite wearing headphones, I was able to hear what sounded like fireworks coming from outside. Now, it wasn't remotely fireworks season, and when I heard a second bang, I realized that it sounded more like a gunshot than a firework, but not quite that either. I climbed over my bed and peered out the window. A disturbing orange glow was coming from the back garden of one of the houses on my side of the street, right at the end. Now, at first, I wasn't sure what I was seeing until I heard another explosion and a pillar of flame shot up into the air. Immediately, I called the fire brigade and then the leader of the neighborhood watch. I still wasn't sure which garden was on fire. My friends live at the penultimate house in the terrace, and I was worried it was their garden. I ran outside and was surprised to discover I was alone. The first thing I did was run to the end of the street, and that's when I realized that it was the side garden of the final house in the row, number 20, which was on fire. And from what I could tell, it was the garden shed, but the flames were licking dangerously towards the house itself, which was pretty dilapidated and, in particular, had a wooden balcony which could easily catch fire. I ran straight to number 19 and knocked, waking them up, and started yelling that the next door was on fire and it could spread to their house and they needed to get out of there right away. Now, as soon as I left number 19 with the family in tow, I was met by other neighbors who had also heard the commotion. A few of us had already called the fire brigade at the same time, and we were assured that they were on their way. I looked around, and I could not see the guy who lived in number 20. I assumed that he would have been first to evacuate, but no. Entering his garden was impossible, as he had a big wooden gate which was locked and would have been too slow to climb over. So in my infinite wisdom, I decided to head down the footpath that headed into town and try and yell for the guy who lived there, and also his cat, who I was very fond of. I took a few steps down from the footpath when suddenly there was another explosion from the shed. A huge, billowing wall of flame rolled over the wall and came thundering towards me, and the fire got so close to me that it singed my eyebrows and the hairs on my arms. I jumped backwards. If I had taken one single step forwards, I would have been hit by that wall of flame. Now, I'm certain that someone was looking out for me that day because I was so close to being immolated that, damn, it's honestly scary to even think about to this day. Now, the first brigade showed up and then the cops. And when the fire was put out and all the commotion had died down and some time had passed, We eventually discovered through our neighborhood watch liaison that it had been an act of arson. Someone had set the neighbor's shed on fire. Unfortunately, the neighbor had been storing a whole bunch of aerosol cans and fuel in his shed, which he really wasn't supposed to do, which had led to the fire being far more serious than was likely intended and far more dangerous. The reason that the owner hadn't fled the house was because he was actually away, staying with his son up country, and you'll be pleased to know that the cat was fine and was the first to flee. Now, I can't be sure, but I'm absolutely certain that the trio who set the fire to the hedge were also the ones who burned the shed. When they'd been walking past number 20, some of their vulgarity had been directed at the man who lived there in the house, so they clearly knew him, and there was a nearby pub which had CCTV cameras, and of course it wasn't working at the time, so nobody was identified. The arsonist or arsonists were never caught, but I know who it was. It was the drunk alcoholic smokers who recklessly threw burning cigarette butts around, and so just after our street had stopped stinking of a burning hedge, it started stinking of a burning shed. That was a fun year, with the smell of burning everything permeating our lives. At least nothing else had caught fire for nearly 2 decades now, and if it does, then I'm going to leave it up to other members of the neighborhood watch to go heroically diving into those flames. I don't recommend it, and I think I exhausted my luck when I almost caught on fire the first time. But you know, if I'm ever forced to save a cat from the flames, I can't promise I won't dive into that inferno again. I lived with my family on Redacted Street for a few years. It was a close-knit, lovely community full of diversity and friendship, and a whole bunch of us became fast friends, and we'd regularly host barbecues and get-togethers at each other's places. The guys, me included, would often watch football regularly, and we'd generally just have a good time. And that's why it made total sense to set up a neighborhood watch. It seemed like fun at first. The neighborhood was extremely safe, and there wasn't much to really watch out for. But a bunch of us hot-blooded guys thought that it would be a badass idea, and so we went about filing the correct paperwork and completing the correct registrations. And soon, every house had one of those neighborhood watch stickers in their window, and we had a menacing sign attached to a lamppost at the opening of the street. Now, I was very impressed that absolutely everyone in the community signed up. Not surprised really, but still. Of course, nothing happened for a while. We set up a neighborhood watch email group and tested it by using it mostly for group chats. Sometimes we'd do tests. One of us would alert the others that they were going to fake an emergency, and then we would, just to test our reaction times. It was completely silly and really achieved nothing, but it was fun. And that's why I didn't take it entirely seriously when I got Mike's email to the group. Mike was the elected head of this neighborhood watch, and he was a bit of a joker. He was a serious, dependable guy when it came to it, but he was always down for a laugh. His email read like he'd either forgotten to warn us that this was a test or that he figured it was so silly he didn't even need to warn us. Now, I've still got the email archived in my old Hotmail account, and here I'll just read it for you. I've tried to fix its many typos, but Mike wasn't the best at grammar. It read as follows. Guys, there's been a sighting of something effing weird in the neighborhood. I heard from Mrs. O'Bannon and Miss Perks via 2 separate emails that they'd seen an old, withered, dirty-looking homeless guy walking down the middle of the road. Now, okay, we don't judge. Homeless people are allowed to cut through our area. That wasn't the issue, though. The guy was walking a pet on a leash, a pet alligator, according to Mrs. O'Bannon, and a crocodile, according to Miss Perks. Now, they're both willing to admit that as old ladies, they don't have the best eyesight, but they are certain that this is what they saw. Now, as you all know, we live absolutely nowhere near alligator country, and I believe crocodiles only live maybe somewhere south of Florida when it comes to mainland America, so I have no idea how this man would have a pet alligator/crocodile. Either way, be careful out there. You don't want to find yourself as reptile chow. Regards, Mike. Now, immediately, I was on the phone to Mike asking if this was some kind of goof. Now, I could instantly tell that he was serious. He was skeptical, sure, like he'd said, The old ladies didn't have the best eyesight. But what other animal could they have mistaken for a crocodile or alligator? Mike and I tried to come up with some alternatives. A huge, crawling dog? Now that hardly seemed likely. A Komodo dragon? Now that would have been even worse, really. A snake? That's still not great. And after that, we were out of ideas. We knew one thing, though. The neighborhood watch had to be extra vigilant at night until we were sure that we'd seen the last of Crocodile Bum D, as we took to calling him. A pun on the movie character Crocodile Dundee for you youngsters out there. You should watch it, though. Thankfully, my kids were both at summer camp for the next month, and my wife was currently working nights at the hospital. So I was being a bit of a night owl myself to make sure that I got to spend some time with the love of my life instead of missing each other like the ships in the night. And I told Mike that I'd keep an eye out. Unsurprisingly, I saw absolutely no sign of any reptile-walking homeless guy. I did see a disheveled figure staggering down the street at 3 a.m. one night, but soon realized that it was the Petersons' teenage son, clearly drunk and clearly sneaking home. I'm pretty sure he wasn't supposed to be underage drinking, but I didn't report him though. I'm not some snitch. Now, the next night was actually a full moon. It was a beautiful night, warm without being oppressive, and the kind of night that you really didn't want to stay stuck inside on the computer. I'd been neglecting my morning jogs to make sure that I was home to greet my wife, so I decided that at 1 a.m., that was a decent enough time to go quietly jogging around the neighborhood. Everyone knew I was on Crocodile Bum D watch duty, so I figured I wouldn't alarm anyone with my presence jogging around. Now, I've been jogging around for about 10-15 minutes, cursing my dad bod and feeling frustrated at the fact that I'd let myself go a little. I took a break to sort of bend down and control my breathing, and you know the way that joggers do where you rest your hands on your thighs? Well, feeling invigorated, I looked up and immediately saw a figure at the far end of the street. I was standing in the shadow of a tree, so I don't think he saw me at the time, and I watched him for a moment and then realized with horror that it was the infamous Crocodile Bum D. The old ladies that warned us about him had not done him justice. He was an absolute mountain of a man. I could see him pretty clearly because he was strolling down the road in the middle of it, lit up by streetlights on either side. And he wore this huge, filthy coat that was even taller than him, with a hem dragging along the surface of the road. And he wore these huge black boots, and I could hear his stomping footsteps even from over 200 yards away. Now, he had long, straggly hair and a wild-looking beard. I couldn't tell what race he was because of how much hair he had covering his head and face. And in between his footsteps, I heard a scraping and a sort of scuttling, too. Now, I must have seen it already, but my mind had refused to process it. The man was, as the women had said, was walking an alligator on a leash. If it hadn't been for the full moon and the streetlights, it would have been hard to see the creature in the dark. It was almost black, just sort of scraping along the street on a long leash, some distance from its menacing walker. Now, a lot of the following information I learned after the fact, but I'll just fill you in now. While the alligator looked intimidatingly big to me, it turned out to be a juvenile American alligator. And trust me, the fact that it was juvenile and was only about half its full size was a blessing. Those things can grow on average to 12 feet in length. Apparently, this one was set to be on the bigger scale, maybe as long as 14 feet, and I think I might have dropped dead of a heart attack if I was faced with a 14-foot alligator in the middle of my street in the middle of the night. Not that a 7 or 8-foot alligator was really much better, as I was just frozen there, hiding in the shadow of the tree, completely unsure of what to do or say. Now, I knew it was my duty to do something as the designated neighborhood watch reptile hunter, but holy crap, what could I do? I was not approaching that thing. But suddenly I had a stroke of genius. When we'd set up that neighborhood watch, a police liaison officer had come to talk to us about the do's and don'ts. He gave us advice on how to operate so we didn't become an armed militia, you know the things. Now, one thing he did mention is that our state, and specifically our area of the state, had adopted a fairly new system. This system basically meant that you could text to 911 instead of calling. It's a lot more common across the states now, but back when this took place, we were one of the first states to adopt it. Go North Dakota. Now naturally, I was concerned about calling 911 and alerting Crocodile Bum D, who was starting to look more threatening than the name suggested. I quickly slipped behind some tree, pulled out my creaky old smartphone out of my jogging fanny pack, and fired off a quick text to 911. Now I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was something frantic and silly like, "Giant man with an alligator walking down redacted street. Alligator is big. Man is bigger. Send help." Thankfully, as a registered member of the Neighborhood Watch, Mike's deputy no less, I was known to the local cops, so I figured that they wouldn't dismiss me as some prankster. Now, I was also hoping that maybe they would have received other reports about this guy, and he must have come from somewhere. I decided to wait behind the tree for Alligator Man to pass, or for the cops to show up. Unfortunately, my plan did not work out. A few moments after texting 911, I heard a sound that I swear echoes through my nightmares. Now, if you've never heard the sound of an alligator before, then lucky you. I've included a YouTube Shorts link because in case Joel wants to play the sound to illustrate exactly what I heard, but you can look it up. If you didn't play the audio or you can't hear it, then it sounds like a dragon growling. Now tell me that doesn't sound like a freaking dragon. That's what I heard that night. Now, I know in retrospect that this sound isn't actually an alligator even being aggressive, it's just the sound that they make to be curious or on alert. But in the middle of the night, as the creature and the man got closer than I realized, hearing that nearly made me poop my jogging shorts. I'm sorry for the image, but it's true. And then I heard the huge man rasp in the deepest voice I've ever heard, asking his alligator friend what she heard. Now, I'm pretty sure that he already knew he was there because he was saying things like, "Are we being watched, princess? Is there someone up ahead, princess, maybe behind that tree?" Now, my first thought was, no way. The alligator's called Princess. Now, my second thought was, I can't just keep staying hiding here. At the time, I had no idea how fast alligators really were, and I had no idea if this monster of a man was going to release Princess to chase me down if I ran. And so I did the bravest thing I could. I stepped out from behind the tree, greeted the man as cheerily as I could, and told him that I'd just been out for a late-night jog and was taking a breather. The man grunted at me in response, and Princess let out another one of those menacing bellows. Now, I knew I couldn't just say, "Nice to meet you, bye, I'm off to bed now." I didn't want Alligator Man to see where I lived, for starters, and so I decided to try and strike up a conversation with him. "So, taking your gator for a walk, huh?" And the man grunted again in response. I started to ask some questions about her, like where he'd gotten her, clearly somewhere illegal, what her name was, Princess, I already knew that, all that sort of crap, and then I heard both the most blissful and terrible sound I could hear. Sirens in the distance and getting closer. The monster of a man looked at me, and the anger on his hairy, filthy face was impossible to ignore. He grunted out something accusing me of calling the cops on him, and then called Princess to his side. He began to kneel, no mean feat at his size, and I realized with horror that he was moving to unleash Princess. "Princess don't like loud noises," he said. I did not stick around to see whether he actually did unleash Princess or not. I turned tail and sprinted back to my house, which was almost the entire length of the street, and I had never ran that fast before or since. As I fumbled to get my keys into the lock, I was sure that I heard the sounds of the alligator sprinting towards me, although not that I have any idea what an alligator sprinting really sounds like. I managed to finally get my key into the lock and dive inside and kick the door shut. At the same time, I heard the sound of multiple cop cars pulling into my street and my hallway being bathed in flashing lights. I peeked out the window to see a standoff between the officers and that huge man. Thankfully, Princess was on her leash. Maybe she always had been. And it turned out that multiple people had called the cops because a pretty seriously armored animal control duo were also on the scene. One of them was holding one of those devices that let you wrangle an animal around the neck. Now, I couldn't hear exactly what was being said or yelled, but the next series of events was relieving, sure, but it was also one of the most heartbreaking things I had ever seen. I guess the cops managed to persuade the man to let animal control take charge of his alligator, because he knelt down and began to pet her as one of the animal control officers approached and, in his defense, very gently wrangled Princess around the neck. That alligator must have been the most tame alligator in existence, really, because she didn't writhe or wriggle or death roll. Instead, she almost obediently allowed animal control to guide her into the back of their wagon. Meanwhile, this probably 7-foot-tall monster of a man meekly allowed the cops to handcuff him and guide him into one of their cars. I watched as they drove off. He could barely sit up straight in the back of the cop car, he was so tall. And so this had gone from the scariest, most effed up night of my life to something that left me conflicted and kind of sad. I'm a bit of a softie when it comes to animals, and even though this massively intimidating man had an illegal, lethally dangerous pet, and was taking her for a walk down my street, I couldn't help but feel bad. I guess in his eyes, Princess was no different than a dog or the many legal, dangerous exotic pets that people can keep. On the other hand, I was the absolute hero of the neighborhood watch when I told them everything that had happened. We had a meeting the next day over beers and snacks, and I was definitely the man of the hour. I still had this nagging sadness for Princess and Crocodile Bum D, though. Thankfully, I was able to get some updates on the story over the years, and the man, whose name actually was Warren, was indeed in possession of an illegal juvenile alligator. However, as he was able to prove, he'd found her as a baby, abandoned by whoever had originally purchased her as a pet. The two had bonded, and he'd looked after her ever since. He admitted to the cops that he had no idea how large she'd grow, but accepted that she was clearly growing too big for him to manage. Princess, for the most part, had never harmed anyone or committed any crimes. Given the circumstances, nobody involved wanted to euthanize the animal, and eventually an animal sanctuary not too far away was found. The sanctuary had both the means to look after an alligator and a spare space to nurture one who hadn't acclimatized to other members of her species. Now, not only that, it was discovered that Warren had previously worked as a zookeeper many years ago, and while he'd been living homeless and unemployed for some time, he had the necessary qualifications and free time and the ability to relocate. So Princess and Warren went to live and work at the animal sanctuary together. Unfortunately, Warren passed away a couple of years ago due to cancer, but I occasionally exchange emails with the owner of the animal sanctuary, and Princess is doing extremely well. In captivity, she's looking at a good 50 or 60 more years of life, and I know that wherever he is now, Warren is looking down, watching over her. I used to be part of a neighborhood watch group, and I was witness to an absolutely crazy, kind of creepy incident that sticks with me to this day. We live on a street just on the outskirts of a small town which has a higher than average crime rate. Our street itself has always been pretty lucky, avoiding being the focus of the town's worst offenders. There was the occasional attempted break-in, some power tools stolen from a few garden sheds, but that was really it. Now, that was before this spate of car vandalism. Almost every morning, we'd wake up to discover one of our cars had been keyed or the mirrors had been slashed off. Now, in a couple of cases, the badges on the front of the couple of cars had been stolen. Now, this was back when that was a lot easier to do. One of the neighbors owned a Mercedes, and I swear his badge must have been stolen 3 times over the course of a year or so, even after we put a stop to the worst of the vandalism. Now, the vandalism is what spurred us on to start taking the neighborhood watch duties seriously. We spoke to local law enforcement, asked for the best tips we could, befriended a community officer, and got a direct line to the local station. And they also agreed to send a patrol into our cul-de-sac as many nights as possible. Now, not to belittle our boys in blue, but I don't think I ever actually saw a cop patrolling our street. I guess in fairness, they did have better things to do, like preventing murders and violent stuff in the city, so it's not like I hold it against them. And that's what the neighborhood watch was for anyway. The vandalism continued though, so about 5 or 6 of us guys volunteered to take night duty until the vandal was caught. Now surely, if we spent the next night watching the small cul-de-sac, we'd catch that person or multiple people in the act. Now that's what you'd think anyway, and yet somehow after a couple of weeks of vigilance, we didn't spot a single suspicious character. And yet the vandalism continued. It was like the culprit was Spec Ops or a ghost or something crazy. But what kind of Spec Ops soldier spends his time army crawling along the ground keying cars? I wish I could offer an explanation of who did it and how, but that was still something we never discovered. Instead, this vandalizer decided to retire himself and go out with a bang. There had been a car parked at the end of our cul-de-sac for what seemed like forever. It had clearly been abandoned there, and a number of us neighborhood watch members had stuck flyers all over the car, pleading with the owner to just move along. All the tires had deflated by this point naturally, and the paintwork was incredibly rusty. Now, we called the city council about it multiple times, but nothing was ever done. In the end, it just became sort of a staple of the street. We called the car Christine, after the Stephen King story, because it had the vague air of being haunted, or at least kind of sinister. Now one night, it was my turn on night watch, and I was just working on my laptop looking out the window when I noticed a glow coming from the end of the cul-de-sac. My house was in the middle, so I had to look around to see exactly what it was. Immediately, I realized Christine was on fire from the inside. I ran outside, careful not to get too close, and these flames were just picking up inside of Christine's seats, but I couldn't immediately see a broken window or any way that the fire could have actually been started inside the car. I called the cops on my cell phone, so I'm glad I paused to do so because moments later, Christine exploded outward. It wasn't the kind of huge epic explosion you might see in the movies or expect from Call of Duty or something. I guess in part this was because the car had been sitting there for so long without any gas that there wasn't too much fuel to actually explode. It was enough to send pieces of shrapnel flying into the road or pieces of glass into the car parked near Christine, though, and it would certainly have been strong enough to cause me some serious damage if I'd actually approached like I had planned to. And soon the cops showed up, as did the fire department, and the vehicle's blaze was extinguished. Over the next few days, we learned that the fire had definitely been arson. A small hole had been drilled through the glass of one of Christine's windows, a tiny bit of accelerant had been poured through it, and then someone had fed a burning rag into the car. Now finally, the cops and the city council put up some effort into tracking Christine's owner, and this went absolutely nowhere. As it turned out, the license plate was just completely fake, registered to no vehicle on record, and the only thing they were able to trace was the engine, which belonged to a totally different, much older car that had been supposedly scrapped many years before. Now, there's no way Christine would have been able to drive at all with that engine installed, and the whole thing was just some mystery. Nobody had any idea when the car had turned up or what the purpose of all of it really was. Had the vandalism been some kind of preamble in order to burn Christine for some purpose? Some of us half expected the cops to find a charred body in the trunk, but there was nothing like that. The wreckage of the car got towed, and from that day forward, the vehicular vandalism just kind of stopped. Various other things happened with the neighborhood watch since then. I confronted a burglar, and one of my neighbors helped the cops arrest an SA offender on the run, and we successfully chased off a gang of drug dealers who'd started operating on the corner. But nothing ever came close to being as puzzling and mysterious or creepy as that series of vehicular vandalism and the mysterious Christine, the impossible car. Now, it's been nearly a decade since then, and I still think about it from time to time. At the very least, I wish I knew who had been responsible for the vandalism and how they'd been able to slip under my nose quite so successfully. But I guess some mysteries just never end up getting solved. I'm going to start this by saying that I love the idea of the Neighborhood Watch Initiative. I've moved house since this story took place, and I'm part of an unofficial Neighborhood Watch myself. I regularly help out, and I'd say that I'm a proud member. Now, it wasn't always the case. I used to live in a small ranch-style house in a relatively rural neighborhood. I didn't know much about the concept of neighborhood watch groups at the time, and even less so about the type of neighborhood watch group in my area. I don't really want to name the group or explain who they were because it'll open up a can of worms, but let's just say that they were a specific type of neighborhood watch group where all the members were of a certain heritage, which I was not, and therefore I was never invited to join or be any part of their group. But within a day of moving in, I did receive a surprisingly professional-looking pamphlet detailing who they were and what they did. In short, they kept an eye on the neighborhood for undesirables, bad behavior, and any threat to their way of life. My vague understanding of a neighborhood watch group was that they were a group of people who kept an eye out for crime or vandalism, but that didn't seem to be the case here. It seemed more like a homeowners association, but they were adamant in their literature that they were a neighborhood watch group. And boy, did they send a lot of literature. Almost every week I received a neighborhood watch newsletter, but these mostly consisted of lists of things I should or shouldn't do as a good member of the community. The pamphlets I received seemed specifically designed for people like me, i.e. people who didn't quite fit in to their culture. I don't want to say that they were outright hostile, but they made it very clear that I didn't entirely belong and I wasn't one of them. I had no idea which of my neighbors actually belonged to this neighborhood watch group, but almost every neighbor I tried to befriend or even be remotely friendly with seemed to snub me or look down on me. They were all a fair bit older than me, with the youngest pushing 50 aside from a small handful of families who kept to themselves. And there was one neighbor I befriended, though. I'll just call him Devin. Now, he was a black guy who had lived in the neighborhood with his wife until she tragically passed away a couple of years ago. We became buddies, and I soon found out that he'd been made to feel as ostracized by the neighborhood watch as I had. And according to Devin, they'd barely even offered sympathy when his wife had passed. Their biggest concern seemed to be informing him that if he was holding the wake at home, he'd have to limit how many cars parked in the street because otherwise it might become inconvenient for the others. Now, I was horrified at this. The man had just lost his wife, and the neighborhood watch, as they called himself, were concerned that too many people might want to support him and pay their respects. And so we kind of bonded over how much of a bunch of expletives this neighborhood watch group was. Now, we took to calling them the homeowners a-holes. Anytime either of us did end up speaking to one of the members of the neighborhood watch, particularly a very elderly man called Elijah, we intentionally referred to them as a homeowners association after realizing how much they seemed to irrationally anger them. Now, it wasn't long before I started receiving personalized letters on their pretentious customized neighborhood watch letterhead complaining about various things. My lawn needed trimming, my car was parked too far from the curb, and I should only ever park in my driveway, never mind the fact that I was applying new asphalt at the time. Now, I wrote back informing them that this seemed like something an HOA should be concerned with, not a neighborhood watch group, especially one of their persuasion, and shouldn't they be on the lookout for crimes and vandalism? Mike's garden shed had been broken into a few weeks before, and there certainly hadn't been any neighborhood watch keeping an eye then. They didn't respond to this, but 2 weeks later, I received another letter informing me that an untoward-looking gentleman had been seen on my property on multiple evenings. Now, this confused me at first until I realized that they were talking about Mike, their own neighbor. Now, we couldn't outright come out and accuse them of racism because they never specified details of who they were talking about other than saying he appeared suspicious. But you know, it wasn't hard to read between the lines. I think I was angrier about this than Mike was. I guess he was used to the neighbors being kind of hostile, which he said had been going on ever since he and his Iranian wife moved in. As an Iranian guy myself, this made me even more angry for a bunch of reasons, and Mike really had to work hard to calm me down. And that's when he hit me with the news. He was moving out in 3 months. Now, I was kind of mad at him. He was going to leave me with these people who clearly didn't want us here. And that's when he suggested that I sell up and, for the time being, move in with him as his roommate. Now, it felt kind of juvenile, as men in our late 20s and early 30s respectively, but Mike was moving to my dream city, San Francisco, and I had family there. It wasn't actually a bad idea, so it was decided. We'd leave this weird, creepy neighborhood watch cult in our rearview mirror and move out. And that's when things got really crazy. I started receiving notes again on the neighborhood watch letterheads, and this time they were accusing me of running a meth lab in the basement. At first, that's all they were, statements and accusations. And then they escalated. I could call the cops and shut you down, but I won't. Not yet. That kind of thing. And the next, I received an ultimatum telling me to shut the meth lab down or something terrible would happen. Now this was all insane. Obviously, I was not running a meth lab in my basement, and the biggest piece of evidence in my defense was that I did not even have a basement. I guess some of the other houses in the spread out neighborhood did, and whoever was accusing me of this was one of those basement owners. Presumably he or she assumed my house was just the same. I showed Mike, and what started off as a kind of joke soon turned pretty scary. We were counting down the days until the move, just 6 weeks now. And that's when I got the most terrifying letter yet, still written on neighborhood watch letterhead paper, and the writing was scrawled, erratic, and somewhat mental. The writer threatened that if I didn't shut my meth lab down within a week, which I was clearly running with a friend, who the author identified with a slur that I won't repeat here, then both of our houses were going to be cleansed by holy fire, quote unquote. Mike and I debated whether this was a metaphor or something more. Our question was answered when the hedge bordering my front yard was set ablaze in the middle of the night. The next morning, after a sleepless night and some wonderful aid from the fire department, I was met with another insane note claiming that this was a taste of what we were to expect. Now, obviously, I informed the cops at this point. They took all the notes for evidence just in case they could find any trace fingerprints, and I made photocopies before the cops took them and decided enough was enough. I was going to confront the leader of the neighborhood watch, a man I'd thus far completely avoided, and his name is Samuel. Now, with Mike as backup, we went storming over to Samuel's house. Now, the wind was knocked out of our sails a little when the door was answered by his adorable daughter who invited us in. And then Samuel's wife offered us hot drinks and cookies, and it was like cultural whiplash. Eventually, Samuel arrived home from his round of golf and sent the family away. We confronted him with the letters, angrily thrusting them right at his face, and we hit him with everything. How the neighbors had made us all feel unwelcome, how this kind of insanity was not the type of thing a neighborhood watch should be engaging in, and we asked if the organization was even registered with the local police or officials in any way. All the while, Samuel was just sitting there, quietly taking in our rage as he read over the notes. And when he was done, he looked at us with a face as pale as a ghost, and to his credit, he admitted that he and the neighbors had felt like myself, Mike, and his wife had not been the best fit for the neighborhood. He admitted that the pamphlets we were sent were intentionally hostile, that there were a number of neighbors, particularly the old folks, who like to keep things culturally insular. Now, I'd just like to reiterate at this point that this wasn't a regular sort of white thing. It wasn't even just a group of white people just trying to drive us out. It was a lot more complex than that, but I don't want to go into the whole story here due to the current events. I'll just leave it up to you to decide what I'm talking about, but it wasn't a case of random white people acting hostile towards BIPOC folk. It was weirder than that, which is all I'll say on the matter. Now back to Samuel. He swore blind on his faith and his family that he had no knowledge of these handwritten, threatening notes and had no idea who sent them. I believed him. He'd been so bluntly honest with us to that point that I had no reason not to. Now, Mike was less convinced, but I managed to persuade him. The one thing that did disturb us both was when Samuel said he had an idea and that both Mike and I should be very, very careful. He asked if there was any way we could escalate our move. When we told him there wasn't and that we were locked in for the next 6 weeks, Samuel told us to leave everything with him. Remember the old man Elijah who I mentioned earlier? Well, he died of a heart attack 3 days after we confronted Samuel, and the note stopped. The neighbors started being more friendly towards us, so much so in fact that some of them went out of their way to bring Mike and I these delicious food dishes, and Samuel invited us for dinner multiple times. Mike was still suspicious and didn't accept invites, but I at least tried to play nice with Samuel. Mostly I was curious to dig into what might have happened with Elijah. Samuel never let anything slip. He was a very slippery, intelligent character, but he dropped enough hints for me to know that Elijah had been the one sending the notes and that maybe, just maybe, his little heart attack had been a lot more convenient than coincidental. All in all, it was like living in Twin Peaks or the Twilight Zone. I was extremely happy to get out of there with Mike. Now, I stayed with him for around 6 months before moving into a place of my own with a wonderful woman that I met in Frisco, who I'm now proud to call my wife. We live in the city, and Mike lives nearby, and there's absolutely no official neighborhood watch to speak of. We all just look out for each other and act like good neighbors to each other. And that's all you need, really. The rest can work under the right circumstances, but when a group of people like our former neighborhood watch get together, there's a danger that it can spawn folks like Elijah who take things way too far, or people like Samuel who in many ways were the most chilling characters of them all, even if his actions might have saved us in the end. Frankly, I just don't want to meet any of them again or any of their ilk. I'm pretty happy with my diverse melting pot of city neighbors, thank you very much. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, go to San Francisco to get yourself a poop needle.